Good morning, guys, and welcome out to Revolution. We're continuing on with our Byzantine school. So the Byzantine school is something that has been on my heart for a while. And so what we're going to look at is we are going to examine the lives of the reformers. We're going to examine people like Erasmus. And today we're looking at an interesting guy called Aldus Manutius. And so if you don't know who Aldus Manutius is, watch this program and you'll find out. And so really what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this video of how Aldus Manutius saved civilization with G. Scott Clemens. And so I'm going to start from the beginning and go all the way through. It goes for an hour. And I'll stop it at pertinent places just to chat and relate it back to the Bible issue, bibliology, Bible versions, etc. And so I think we'll just jump straight into it. I don't think I've got any other announcements. We did have a debate yesterday with, I had a debate with James Snap Jr. Dwayne Green was the moderator. And now I know a lot of people are saying, wow, Dwayne Green did a really good job. He did a really good job. Like out of 10, I'd give him a 10. It was so good. He was very relaxed. He's very charismatic, and he did a very good job. And so we had me and James had a little bit of banter in the debate. But if you go to the after show, instead of sort of jumping in and joining us, James wanted to just remain in the chat and call us flat earthers and things like that. It didn't really work out well for him because as much as you get tempted to just call the other side an idiot, you know, you got to control yourself. And I think most debates that I've been in so far have been debates where you're looking at the information and people just sitting there with an open Bible or you know, looking up claims to see whether they're true or not. Then they go, okay, well, yeah, Nick's had a good point there, or James had a good point there. But it gets so muddied when you're a flat earther, and you know, obviously, I'm defending the King James and the Textus Receptus, so I'm going to be going back and mentioning people like Beza and other folks of the Reformation, and he's just like, well, you keep mentioning Beza and the guys from the Reformation, and it's like, yeah, it's like if you were defending Ford or something and you keep going back to Henry Ford or, you know, whoever invented the latest car or designed it or whatever. It's like, yeah, because I'm defending that, you know, it just seems strange, you know. So anyway, but I did enjoy it. And I think, you know, James did well, apart from the ad hominem stuff. You know, it was a good debate. I'd like to see more of it. I know James Snap is always willing to debate people. So line up. I was glad that TurretinFan came into the chat, and you know, it was this interesting thing where I was going through the material for Luke chapter 2 verse 22 with their purification or her purification, and when I listened to TurretinFan's material on it, I was like, this is exactly what I mean. Like he was pretty much defending that reading against, you know, the Orthodox and Roman Catholics. But it was almost like a Textus Receptus defense, and defending why Theodore Beza had recognized that this causes a huge error in the Bible. And so anyway, I had fun yesterday. It was a great day. Okay, James Snap is here today. So he says, dogmatic KJV onlyism is the biological equivalent of flat earthism. Okay, and that's fine to say that. I made my case that you know, we do have some interesting people in the debate community, and someone like David Preston, you know, he believes that the Apocrypha is inspired, and so to debate him, you have to learn his position, which no one else believes. Like usually, if you're trying to come against Mariolatry, or you know, you're trying to, you know, I'll defend some eschatology or something like that. Usually someone else somewhere believes it. But like if you're debating against Jehovah's Witnessism or Seventh-day Adventism, but the thing is with James, you don't know what he thinks until he's in front of you, because he's not offering all his research in front of you. And so you're sort of like, oh, James, do you throw this in or out? You don't know. And so obviously through the debate with the last verse, when James was showing a few slides and things like that, I was just reading through what I was going to say. And I didn't even realize that he was actually defending it, because I wasn't really paying attention. I should have been. But that's how flimsical James's position is. I don't know. You just don't know. Is he going to throw this out or in? Because it's all over the place. And that's the main point that I was making was James has his own unique Bible. And it's like no one else in the world has that. Where is this Bible being translated? Where is it, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. Everyone wants a Bible. Where is it? Where is it in English? Where is it in Greek? Let alone where is it in the rest of the world? And so James said, Luke wrote Ufton in Luke 2:22, stop trying to usurp what Luke was inspired to write. Well, I know that Bruce Metzger and others, they believe that you can have mistakes in the originals. Well, I don't believe God makes mistakes. And so God would not contradict himself by having a clear error like this in the Bible. And so this has been recognized by Beza, by the King James translators, who I respect their scholarship much more than anyone alive. Like if someone alive had that level of scholarship, I would ask them and say, well, what do you think? But I just don't think that I have that level. I don't think James has that level. And so I'm looking at them going, well, they understood the languages fluently. They were reading manuscripts frequently, and not just reading it going, oh, okay, I've figured out what that one word means, and these other ones have the same word. They're reading through these manuscripts, seeing the issues of, of ton, of taste, of ties, of looking at all these different genders, the he, the she, their plural endings, the conflated the way that the Greek language works. And so these people are reading it fluently, going through these manuscripts and reading it like we would read the newspaper. And so obviously they're going to have superior conclusions to people who don't read the language. And so I just don't trust that someone who doesn't read the language can really work out what is being said and understand and see patterns in the Word of God that cause people to say, well, that should be in or that should be out. We see that with the last 12 verses of Mark or the Pericope Adulterae, where on one side, Hodges and Fasted, they'll turn around and say, well, we see that it should be in. But then on the other side, you get these experts to say, well, we should see it should be out. And they're all saying it's because, well, we've looked at the internal patterns of Mark's writings or John's writings, and they don't match up. Or then they turn around, this other group says, oh, no, they do match up. And so who are we going to trust? None of these guys, I believe, are at the level of the King James translators or of Beza or of Stephanus or of Erasmus. And so obviously I'm going to go with people who have that type of education. And as much as I take my hat off to James for defending the Pericope Adulterae, the last 12 verses of Mark, and several other verses, I don't take my hat off to where he changes his mind and goes with critical text readings or Byzantine readings, or sometimes just his own reading. And so I don't think that's good scholarship. And so anyway, we've had a whole debate on that, so feel free to jump in and look at that debate. So Avery F says, if he had the original Luke, I'd appreciate if he made it available to the rest of us. Yeah, it's one of those things where I went back through the Will Kinney debate, and at first I was tempted to conclude, because sometimes Will does just, read through other versions have got this, and other language Bibles have this reading. And I thought, well, I don't really want to go that route. But at the end of the day, I thought, well, actually, what we were saying is it's more, I mean, people can look at the manuscript evidence, and it depends on who's looking at it. If you get a critical text guy looking at the evidence, he'll favor Vaticanus and Sinaiticus over everything. We see that with the last 12 verses of Mark. If we get someone like James looking at the evidence, I don't even know how to really define what he's doing, because really no one else is doing what he's doing, because he comes up with different conclusions. Then if we look at Maurice Robinson or Pickering or Pierpont, and we look at these other guys, well, they've got different methodologies. And so, we're going to have to choose one. And I personally feel that the scholarship that has, like, I don't even really, I respect Dean John William Burgon and his scholarship, but I would never put him on the level of a King James translator or Theodore Beza or Stephanus or Erasmus. Like, he was good, but I would say he was sort of like 40% of what these people are. Where people are looking at him going, yes, what an amazing scholar and all the rest of it. To me, I'm like, yeah, good, but not that good. He would make a good assistant to some of these guys. And so where does that put the rest of us? You know what I mean? Hudson says, hi, guys, already trolling James. Hudson says, the Have It Your Way Bible. Yeah, I mean, it is different to, like, if I debated Maurice Robinson, he would have a whole bunch of different conclusions to James. Then if I debated someone else, a majority text guy or a Byzantine guy, that they would have other things. And so it's just every man for himself. And where is their definitive, corrected, 100% Bible with a list of, we won't include this or we will include this? And it's hard to even figure out what James Snap includes or doesn't include. And so even just in the debate, I was confused over whether he's including a whole verse or not. And he was debating for it, where in my mind, he was showing me places that needed changing or that were erroneous in the King James. So obviously, I started that one. He went through it, and I guess it's a mistake on my part for not really intentively listening to what he was saying for those 5 minutes. But I was just sort of reading my own little spiel that I was going to talk about. But then, but at the end of the day, I think that actually works out better for my case, that I don't know. Like, if I can't figure it out, how can just the average Joe on the street, he's like, James, where's the Bible? And what does the Bible say? It's like, well, what do you think about this verse? And they read it, and it's like, well, no, that one's not in there. But what about this one? Well, that one is in there. And it's like, well, can you just give me the thing? Does James actually have a Bible with all those changes in it? He was talking to Will Kinney, saying that he favors the Antoniadis text of 1904 done by the Greek Orthodox Church. But then we see a lot of the changes that have been made are still in there, are still in that text that he wants to chop out. And so he doesn't go with that text all the time. So to me, that's confusion. But I guess today you have lots of people who are majority text, Byzantine text, and they read the New King James with Textus Receptus readings in it. They look at the margin and they do what they're told by Thomas Nelson to create their own endings and their own beginnings and their own verses. If it says the NU takes this out, well, if you want to follow the NU, the National Aland United Bible Society text, you follow that. If you want to follow the M for majority, you follow that. You just create your own as you go along, with those variants. And so, but it doesn't have all the variants, but you'll get your Bible the way that you want it. It's like choose your own adventure books that occurred in the 1980s. These choose your own adventure books, you could have the hero die early or it just depended which way you wanted to go in these books. And so people have their own choose your own adventure Bibles. Some people, they want the last 12 verses of Mark deleted. James Snap, thankfully, doesn't want that. He wants them to remain. But the Comma Johanneum, he wants to throw it out. He wants that out of the Bible. And so anyway, so I think we'll move on from there. So Christian Chittista says, hello. Christian said, God would not deceive his people by giving them a corrupt text for 1,500 years. I recommend that you listen to Jeff Riddle, James. Yes, Jeff Riddle is very good on this issue. Hudson says, Greek Orthodox Church, is James Snap a Eastern Orthodox Christian? And this is one of the things, like, I understand that in the Reformation period, going back to the Greek did mean to jump into the world of the Greek Orthodox. But we recognize that the Greek Orthodox Old Testament is completely corrupted with the Septuagint. And so that they believe it's inspired of God. But we believe it's full of errors and it's corrupted and all the rest of it. So why would we then just assume that the Byzantine text doesn't need like fixing or amending? Any ancient work, like even we're going to look at Aldus Manutius today. He might have had Homer come across his desk and he had to work out what is, like, he might have had 6 editions of it. He's got to work out which edition is the best one. And obviously, like, learning these languages, learning Greek and Latin and other languages that these works were translated into, that helps being fluent in the language, because, you know, someone like James Snap would be viewed by someone who was in the early church with the way that he's reading the Greek and everything like that as, like, you know, an Indian salesperson. Now, I've got a lot of Indian friends. I speak to a lot of people in Pakistan. We run ministries over there. My wife's Pakistani. And so oftentimes I'll just, you know, we'll put on the Indian accent. Some people see that as racist. I don't. You know, we just have fun with it. But if someone rang you up and said, hello, I want to teach your children English, you're like, well, actually, I don't think you speak English that well. But that would be better than what James Snap can speak in Greek. And so this is the problem. Are you going to trust someone with your English language who you know probably can't speak it that well, who's probably not educated in it that well? Are you going to trust someone with the Greek? Why have we got this facade that someone who can just learn the Greek alphabet and learn how a pronunciation guide can decipher the Greek language? And when we look at experts who could do this, like Aldus Manutius or Erasmus, these guys could obviously go through the Greek language. And just like I mentioned with Dan Wallace, if it had, in the preamble to the United States Constitution, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect onion, you would think, no, it should say union. Everyone would think it should say union, because it's not to do with cooking. It's not to do with making a menu or anything like that. It's to do with creating a union, forming a more perfect union. We all know that. Everyone instinctively knows that. And so someone knowing the language fluently can spot those issues. If someone says, can you pass me a apple? You're like, well, it should be an apple. You just instinctively know that. These are the type of things that these are just small examples. There would be thousands of examples in the English language that we know when someone, I work around foreigners every day, Spanish-speaking people, French-speaking people, Germans and Italians, and so many people who speak different languages. And oftentimes I'll spend weeks and weeks with these people, and we'll end up learning, different words and things like that. But they have their distinct way of saying things. And so you have to be fluent at a language at a certain level. And I just don't think that James has it. I know I don't have it. And that's why I appeal to authorities who do have it, like Georgios Babiniotis, who is an expert in the Greek language. And so looking at these manuscripts, looking at like Aldus, he would have had documentation come across his desk like Homer, and he would have had to make decisions of what's in and what's out. And world-leading experts all around the world say that Aldus was absolutely legendary. They say Erasmus, Erasmus is more revered by people who are secular than by people in the Christian academy, because he's been so demonized because of the Textus Receptus issue. That they want to demonize the Textus Receptus, so they have to throw him under the bus. But if you actually Google Erasmus, it's not Christian stuff that comes up first. It's people revering him for his learning and knowledge and teaching. And even in Christian circles, people should realize the influence that Erasmus had on John Calvin, for example, on Theodore Beza, for example. His influence in Europe was massive. I mean, when you look at Tyndale translated Erasmus's Greek Bible into English. Then he translated one of his books about being a Christian soldier, and there was Reformation in England. That's how powerful Erasmus's works were. And he's just an idiot. He rushed to print. He didn't know what he was doing. He made these rash wagers, and I'll put a verse in if you find it, sort of thing. And yeah. But when we look at normal textual criticism, so just going back to the Old Testament of the Orthodox Church, the Old Testament there, people would look at that and say, hang on, this is an error. And thankfully, we can judge the Old Testament by the Hebrew. We don't have to go with the Septuagint or the Greek edition. But thankfully, we don't just have to go to the Hebrew and just look at that. We can examine, with the Vulgate, we can examine with the Septuagint, where we need to on tiny little minutiae, and understand, what was going on there. But thankfully, with the New Testament, we have the Greek, but we also have the Latin. And if you think the book of Romans was sent to the Romans, they were Latin-speaking people. It was sent to them in Greek. That would have been translated immediately. They would have been preaching it in the churches in Latin. So Latin is important. It's an ancient language. That would have been about 60 AD. And then in all the other churches of the world, in Syriac, and that's why you can go through, when you look at Theodore Beza, he said he believed that the Syriac was as close to the original as you could get, in a sense where there is a certain quote that Jan Kranz used, and I don't want to take him out of context, but he basically placed the Syriac on a very high level. And because his friend Tremellius, he did a Syriac Bible. He did the second Syriac Bible. The first one was done in 1555. In 1569, Tremellius did his edition, and he was fluent in Hebrew because he was a Jew. And he worked with Jenius, who was fluent in Arabic. So you got all these guys surrounding Beza. The level of scholarship is like, it's next level scholarship. Okay. And that's just Beza, let alone Erasmus and these other guys. So when I'm appealing to these scholars, I'm appealing to something that I think, if people don't know how learned these people are, then they're almost illiterate in the history of the Reformation. And some people become so twisted against the Textus Receptus, and I guess maybe they've jumped on a forum and some King James only people were nasty. They weren't King James only, they were King James ugly or whatever. And they get offended, but then they just seem to throw out logic where you should respect the people of the Reformation. James was like, oh, you keep appealing to the 1500s. I'm going back to Chrysostom. And it's like, okay, you're going back to Chrysostom. Well, Henry Saville collected 15,600 manuscript sheets of Chrysostom. He worked with Lancelot Andrews. He worked with John Boyce, Andrew Downes, and they produced the complete works of Chrysostom. And so they're collecting his manuscripts. And here's James, I appeal back to him. It's like, well, don't you think they knew what he was saying too? You know what I mean? It's just, so that's why I appeal back to them, because obviously if I'm going to choose a scholar who knows about Chrysostom, Henry Saville's it. He's the boss of Chrysostom. He wrote the book on it. Here's James Snap, like, I go to Chrysostom, and it's like, yeah, And so anyway, that's enough about me whinging about James Snap, but he did arrive here and start being provocative. But maybe we can set up another debate. That'd be fine. Christian says, God kept the TR pure by providential preservation. Absolutely. There's going to be a Bible somewhere that we can read. Where is it? Was it the critical text that was hidden from history for 1,500 years? Is it James Snap's text that's sort of still in his mind and he hasn't put it down on paper yet? Or, where is it? Hudson says, the Eastern Orthodox have a strange articulation of the Trinity that sounds like Arianism. This might be why 1 John 5:7 fell out of the majority of Greek manuscripts after the Great Schism of 1054. Okay, that's very interesting. Yeah, there is a different way that they look, and they actually believe in, I think it's, don't quote me on this, but it's like Theotokos or something like that, where they believe they become a god. They sort of become one with God, which is very different. Sounds a bit like Mormonism. Scullery said, how can anyone know exactly what the autograph was? Well, see, that's one of the things where James is going, well, the original says this, and it's like, okay, well, have you got a URL for that? And he's sort of holding up certain books and things, and it's like, where's this original? Like, I understand some people can purposely conflate original languages with original documents, but he was clearly talking about the originals say this, like the original, like as if he knows what the exact wording of Paul is and John is and all the rest of it, and our Bibles don't match up with it. And it's like, okay, can I check that original too? And he's like, he sort of figured out where the original is, but no one else can. No one else has found the original that he's figured out. And it's like, well, does your original differ from Maurice Robinson's original and Pickering's original, my original? So that's the thing. I believe that we do have exactly what the originals have in the King James, in the underlying received text of the King James in Greek. If that was brought back to the Apostle Paul and the letters were capitalized, it would be exactly what he said. And same with the Masoretic text. I believe that. Christian says, Dr. Van Cleek uses a great exegetical argument for it. Yes, I wish that I had his brain. I wish I could download what he knows. When I listen to him and his father, there is a wealth of information. And even as I'm not a Calvinist, but as a non-Calvinist, I do take my hat off to some of these Reform guys. They have a very good way of defending the Word of God through their presuppositions and through what the Word of God says. The Bible says it's going to be like this, and so it should be like that. And so I think, sometimes we can jump into all the evidences and, do show a whole bunch of manuscripts here and there. But at the end of the day, these guys tend to deal more with a philosophy, differing philosophies. And I think that's a very interesting path to go down and something that I want to study further. He refers to Psalm 12, 119 and Matthew 5. There are other manuscripts to look at, other scriptures to look at, sorry. Yes, it is like Psalm 119. I remember when I first became a Christian and reading through that, every verse is about the Word of God, this, the Word of God, that, the law is this, the precepts are that. And I'm like, you can't but fall in love with the Word of God when you're born again. And so that's why it does sadden me that so many people are running away from the Word of God or attacking the Word of God. Avery F says it is theosis. Yeah, what did I say? Theotokos. I just made that up. Theosis. Yeah, we used to become part of God. It's pretty weird. They basically apply extreme allegory to 2 Peter 1:4. I'll just quickly look that up. 2 Peter 1:4. There are so many pop-ups on these Bible sites now. I know they've got to make money, but it's like, man. King James Bible, whereby we are given unto us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these you might be partaker of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. To me, we already have this divine nature, because we walk by faith. We're born again. So whereby are given unto us exceeding great and precious promises, so that by these we might be partakers of the divine nature. I think we already have the divine nature because we have Christ in us. We are married to Christ. And so Jesus and us have become one. It's like in a marriage, you and your wife become one flesh. You as the bride of Christ and Jesus, the husband, you become one flesh. So whatever he's got, you get. If you marry a millionaire, or your old beat up old car and bike and house, and they're not going to stay the same. That they're going to be updated. And so when you become one with Christ, you come up to his level and you start whining and dining with the, I'm not a drinker of wine, alcoholic wine, but you start whining and dining with the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so things are going to change, and it's a really good study to do. But we become partakers of the divine nature. I think the Orthodox Church teach that you arrive at that stage by certain works, I guess, and a bit of idolatry thrown in. A. Hannah, haven't seen A. Hannah around for a while. Did Aldus really save civilization? Well, we're going to see. You're going to have to watch all 16 hours of this video that I'm going to be stopping and starting and ranting and raving, and then at the end you'll have to make your decision. And so there is a book called How the Irish Saved Civilization. I'll just quickly go through that. How the Irish Saved Civilization by Thomas Cahill. So here we have this book here. -6, 16. Oops. I've got to accept all that. I don't know why they keep accepting cookies and all this. Just take me to the website. How the Irish Saved Civilization. The untold story of Ireland's heroic role from the fall of Rome to the rise of the medieval Europe. So it looks very interesting. And I think it's because they were so isolated. For anyone to go out there and invade them, it was a long way to go. And so they actually kept a lot of records, and they kept a lot of historical documents. I'm pretty sure is it the Book of Kells that was in Ireland for a while. Yeah, I could be wrong. I think it is Book of Kells. Yeah, it's in Dublin. Trinity College. So obviously we know Trinity College because it's got Codex Montfortianus there. So this is the famous picture of Trinity College that James White went to and saw Codex Montfortianus. And so it'd be a great place to go and visit. But usually it's these type of pilgrimages. People think that because they've seen a manuscript, they've instantly become an expert at it. I mean, someone could just sit on their computer at home and figure out more about that Codex Montfortianus than James White going up to a glass cabinet and going, wow, and then walking away, Avery F says, I'm just here for the ranting and raving. Well, James Snap joins back in, it might get like that. A. Hannah says, I have one about the Scots saving civilization. Oh, okay. It must have been a bit of a trend. Yeah, we have Irish. Well, they're all just different covers. And so I wonder, if I go to Wikipedia, it might actually have, I wonder if Australians save civilization. I don't think we have. Maybe we're doing it right now. Maybe everyone else will get wiped out except for Australia. Okay, so let's start with this video. So it's got a few little introduction things. I'll put it on like double time or whatever. But when we start getting into the meat, and we've sort of got to understand the story of Scott Clemens too, because he is an expert on Aldus. So who is Aldus? Aldus was the best printer in Europe for Greek documents around the time of Erasmus. Erasmus lived with him for 9 months. So what we're going to do, we're going to go and look at all of who Erasmus's friends were, so we can get a broader understanding of Erasmus's circles. And then eventually we'll examine the claims of modern text critics and their disdain for Erasmus, and whether he just flippantly added verses and subtracted verses, and what he was doing when he did his New Testament. So let's start this video. So G. Scott Clemens, How Aldus Manutius Saved Western Civilization. So there's no sound yet. Usually I start it with no sound, but I've already checked that button. So it's quite embarrassing. Nearly every video I forget the sound. 2015, New York City. Okay.
Hello. Welcome to the first lecture in the Herb Allen lecture series for this fall term. The lecture series is part of the Type Cooper program, which is the postgraduate certificate program in typeface design here at Cooper Union. And it was created together with between Cooper Union and Type Directors Club. My name is Alexander Techelovsky. I am one of the instructors here in the program. And I want to first thank Heffler & Co. for sponsoring the recording of all of these lectures. The recordings are all of the past recordings, and the future recordings for this term and all of the other terms are going to be available on the Vimeo channel that we have. But you can also find them going to our website. I also want to mention the other 3 lectures that we have coming up. There's one next Monday, November 2nd. It is called It Began in Brooklyn, From A to Z and Beyond, and it's a talk by Michael Durrett. November 16th, we have John Stevens, and he's going to present a talk called Expression and Form, Rhythm and Movement. And the last talk of the series is December 7th. It's Sarah Soskolny presenting a talk called H&Co Double Bill, Behind the Scenes of 2 Recent Projects. And it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. G. Scott Clemens has collected the Aldine Press since his days as an undergraduate in the Classics Department in Princeton University. He currently serves as the president of the Greuler Club, treasurer of the Bibliographical Society of America, and is past chairman of the Friends of Princeton University Library. Outside of his bibliophilic interests, Scott is chief investment strategist of Brown Brothers Harriman & Co., privately owned investment firm here in New York City. Scott also curated the exhibition Aldus Manutius, A Legacy More Lasting Than Bronze, which was on display at the Greuler Club this past spring. Hopefully you got to see that. He is also the co-author of a companion volume to this exhibition, which is available for sale right outside. You can see a copy of it open. Well, actually, right there. Yeah, it'll be available right there. So please welcome Scott.
Thank you, Sasha. And thank you all for an interest in a printer who's been dead for 500 years, 8 months and 20 days. Aldus died in 1515, and about 3 or 4 years ago, I had a lunch with George Fletcher, my co-curator of the exhibition, and I said to him, George, if nobody out there is going to be doing a commemorative exhibition of Aldus's influence and contributions to the world of the printed book and typography and book design and editing, et cetera, then we're going to do it. And it was late in a summer afternoon, and we'd had a glass or a bottle of wine, maybe, I can't exactly remember, but we both agreed to it, and we held each other to that. So that's what leads me here tonight. I didn't know this was the first in this year's lecture series. I would have dressed up a little bit. Here's basically the origin of the interest to me. I am haunted by a particular counterfactual history, namely a history in which Aldus never existed. On a very personal and selfish level, I wonder what I would have done for the past 30 years of my life, probably accomplished quite a bit more. But on a much more important basis, I think the world would be an immeasurably poorer place had not the right man, Aldus Manutius, been in the right place, Venice, and Venice plays a role at the right time, the turn of the 15th century, the late Quattrocento. And what I hope to do over the next 30 minutes or so is convince you of that. It's my...
Now, I know some people might think that this is, sort of going back to basics, but for some, they don't know what Venice is. A good friend of mine worked in Venice for quite a long time as a chef, and I've never been to Venice. I'd love to go. So this is Venice here. I'll just show you where some other major places are, because you have Venice here, Milan here, San Marino here. So Florence is known for basically being the place where the Renaissance was circulated around. Nearby, you've got Croatia. Switzerland is just over the mountains. Now, you got to understand these mountains here. This is the Swiss Alps. You've got the Sudeten area, South Germany. So that all of this mountainous region, it's really hard to travel through there. Now, you got Geneva here. So it's not that far from Venice. Marseille. And so let's just zoom out to the bigger picture of Italy. So here you've got Rome. So it's not that far from Venice. So for like when Erasmus, he went and lived in Bologna for, I think it was a year with Paulus Bombasius, who eventually was the Roman curator at the Vatican Library. Sometimes you'll hear James White say, well, he contacted Bombasius and got these readings and stuff like that, or checked if the Comma Johanneum was in Vaticanus. So he lived with Bombasius for like a year, and then he moved to Venice, and he went and worked with Aldus Manutius. So that's the guy who we're talking about today. So when you look at Istanbul here, now Istanbul used to be called Constantinople. The picture here of the Hagia Sophia is the old church that the Byzantine Empire used to have there. Now, roughly around 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks, so the Muslim armies, and they overtook that. So a lot of the Greeks, what did they do? Well, they ended up going to Athens, but a lot of Venice was in league with Constantinople at the time. And so a lot of people ended up going to Venice. And so at the time that Erasmus was in Venice, there was said to be about 5,000 native Greeks living there, which is quite a lot. And if you've ever been in a place where there's a lot of refugees, and this type of thing happened quite frequently in Europe. You'd have a war somewhere, and then all the Romanians would end up on your doorstep, or all the Germans all of a sudden are there, or French. And so they had this happen, and they brought their manuscripts with them. And so this caused a huge interest in Greek culture, Greek language, all the old Greek classics, and the New Testament. And so I just sort of put that into a bit of a perspective on the world scene. And so here you have this little red area here of Venice, that's just smack bang right in the middle of Europe. And so Erasmus, he spent time in England. He was in Paris. He was in Rome. He was in Venice. So he frequented a lot of these places around here. And obviously he was born in Rotterdam. And so here we see Rotterdam. It's only a stone's throw over to England from there, in the Netherlands. So he would have known a lot of these European languages. It was quite common in those days, like say someone like Tyndale, he knew German, he knew Latin, he knew Greek, he learned Hebrew. And so knowing languages, this was part of being a humanist. So nowadays what we have is a lot of people think a humanist is a secular humanist. They usually add that word to it. But a humanist back then was someone who knew the humanities, and that included understanding languages. That would, like, for someone to even be considered a humanist, to have Latin and Greek under your belt was just a normal type of standard, where Erasmus was the prince of the humanists. So that means he was, he far exceeded anyone else in Latin and Greek. And so I just sort of throw that in there just so you can get a bit of a history of where that's happening.
I claim that it is this confluence of people and place and time that enabled Aldus to save Western civilization. No offense to the Irish or the Scottish or whomever else thinks they did it. Half an hour from now, I'm going to convince you that it was Aldus. Imagine a world in which Aristotle and Aristophanes, Euripides, Sophocles existed only as names, that those texts had not come down to us. No Republic, no Oresteia trilogy, no account of the Battle of Thermopylae in Herodotus. The world was very close to losing a lot of that legacy. And again, right man in the right place at the right time saved it. Before I tell you that story, I'm going to tell you a little bit of mine just as background. As Sasha said, I first met Aldus when I was an undergraduate in the classics department at Princeton in the 1980s. Small department and a great library. And I think geography again played a role, because if you've ever been there, the classics department and the library, there's one courtyard in between the two. So it was very easy to get from one to the other. I was surrounded not only by very good classicists, but very passionate and talented book people as well, not least of whom was Bill Scheide, a name that hopefully some of you know. Bill was a third-generation collector. He owned the last remaining copy of the Gutenberg Bible in private hands, which is now at Princeton. Bill passed away last November at the age of 100. There is something about old books that keeps you young. I found this picture and I'm delighted by it. This is a picture of me as a rather young collector. I think I was a senior in college, rather presumptuously lecturing Bill Scheide on the finer points of the Aldine press. And he patiently listened to the whole thing. And as you can tell, I am now twice the man that I used to be, both in wisdom and wit, I'm afraid, at the same time. What really sparked the interest in me was the confluence of classics and the printed book. And really, in particular, the transmission of texts, how texts escaped the fragility of the manuscript tradition and made it into print for the first time. How many of you have read the book or seen the movie The Name of the Rose? Sean Connery is okay, a few. It's a very good movie on a lot of levels, but the depiction of the...
Okay, so I actually... probably about a month ago, I jumped onto YouTube and I typed in The Name of the Rose. I'll just type it in. And they had sort of like, someone had thrown it up onto YouTube. Maybe I'll type in YouTube. And so I won't play it just in case it has a copyright, issue. But The Name of the Rose, if you go through, you can sort of find someone's pieced together some bits. So you sort of end up watching the whole thing in like half an hour and you feel like you've just missed so much. And it's in like 5-minute little sections. So I sort of went through it. And then I was listening to someone else talk about this similar issue about The Name of the Rose, and they showed this whole scene that I didn't know even existed, where they were going through a lot of the books and forbidden books and things like this. And so I think I've really got to, I missed the whole reason to watch The Name of the Rose, because obviously someone who's into books, into Aldus and Erasmus, and they would be interested in that type of thing, which was almost completely omitted in the YouTube series on it. And so, yeah, it was something like this, the Name of the Rose here, and actually it looks like they've got the whole thing there. Okay. Anyway, that's all interesting. But so basically, the name of the rose is, I'll go back to the previous page. It's got Sean Connery in it, who obviously, if you've got a movie with Sean Connery in it, he's a very interesting actor and he's very good. And there's a whole bunch of murders that happen in this particular monastery. But then, spoiler alert, he finds there's a hidden library filled with books, dating back thousands of years, forbidden books that should be burnt by the Vatican and all this. So he's reading them, he's trying to study them, and eventually the whole thing gets burnt to the ground. I think he saves like 2 or 3 books or something. No, it's like 10 books. He carries them down from this huge tower, and it's and there's a bit of a riot that happens in the town, and so it's an interesting film. I don't know where you can just get it and watch it and actually pay for it, because that's what I was looking for. I was looking for somewhere where you could just watch the whole thing. But anyway, so that's what he's talking about with the name of the rose there.
Fragility of the manuscript era. These works that were kept usually in monastic libraries, and they were subject to the ravages of just time itself, but insects and fire, which was the big climactic scene in The Name of the Rose. There's a great story told about a German scholar named Konstantin von Tischendorf, who was visiting monasteries and looking for manuscripts. In the 19th century, visited the monastery of St. Catherine, Mount Sinai. And at the end of his stay, the monk said, well, just before you leave, join us in the refectory for lunch. Oh, I'd be delighted to. So he sits down for lunch and he says, before we start, would you mind if I took a look at the waste paper basket next to your fireplace? And it was in that waste paper basket that Konstantin von Tischendorf found the earliest known manuscript of the Greek Bible, the Codex Sinaiticus, now at the British Library, sadly missing some leaves, which had probably gone to cook breakfast that morning. A very fragile tradition. How these texts escape that tradition is utterly fascinating.
So obviously this guy is secular, so he would have gotten this from the Christians, this official story of Tischendorf, with, probably from Dan Wallace or someone. And, we know that story is most probably fabricated. I actually did a program on that only 3 programs ago, I think it was, when I was looking at the King James only controversy, my latest video of that, examining the book of James White, how he gets the story wrong. But the whole issue was Tischendorf said that they were burning these manuscripts. But at the end of the day, they most probably were not burning them. But James White says they were burning them and then says they weren't burning them, and he doesn't seem to know that involved Sinaiticus. So that's the whole issue with James White's story.
To me, I also learned a fundamental truth as I began thinking about this and learning about this, and that fundamental truth is that authors don't write books. Authors write texts. And then there's an army of people, including book designers and typographers and paper makers and publishers and binders, and that come together to turn the text into a book. That act of creation, each of those decisions made along that way, says something about the way society understands knowledge. And I'm fascinated by that multiform act of creation or translation from text into book. That's why I collect what I collect. Because I was also, again, I'm an undergraduate in college, slightly interested in making some money to fund this burgeoning habit, I went and got a job with a rare book dealer in Princeton by the name of Joe Falcone, who is still in the rare book business in Princeton. And I remember one spring afternoon, he said to me, as if it were yesterday, he said to me, "You're a budding young classicist with an interest in textual transmission. You should collect Aldus Manutius." And I said, "Who's that?" Probably the 2 most fateful and expensive words I have ever uttered, with the possible exception of "I do." And I can say that because my wife was present at the creation of this collection as well. 30 years later, my collection is well over 1,000 volumes and continues to grow. It grew by 1 volume just this morning. So that's my story in a nutshell. Let me tell you Aldus's story. Aldus was born in a small town of Bassiano. It's about 80 miles southeast of Rome in about the year 1452. The actual date of his birth is a matter of some debate.
So with these dates, sometimes it's very important for us to get some key dates in our mind. When I'm studying history, I'll go through and just remember a certain date. And so like a date like 1516, when Erasmus did his edition, 1514, when the Complutensian Polyglot New Testament was printed. So Aldus died 1515. So just knowing that he died in between those two, it can give you a good understanding of things that are written, because here is Erasmus in his annotations talking about the Aldus edition. And so this is Aldus. This is the Aldus he's talking about. And so knowing that he died the year before, it's very important. And so sometimes it's very good to, we obviously, we know 1611, we know 1598, the text of Beza, we know like 1550, Stephanus, the 1516, and sometimes it's good to have a key date that you can latch onto, and then you can build your knowledge on that. I find if I don't do that, I forget things. And so just knowing like 1516 was the date of Erasmus's first edition. 1 year earlier, Aldus Manutius died. And so his name is Aldus Pius Manutius. So it has engraving title of Domenico Maria Manini's Vita di Aldo Manuzio, Venice, Guillaume Battista Novelli, 1759. So I'll just go back a little bit. Okay, so basically that's what's on the title page, and that's in 1759. Okay, so it has Aldus Pius Manutius here. Now this symbol here of the anchor and the dolphin, that gets explained in this. But I read something recently that Erasmus actually inspired that sort of like logo, where it's the speed of a dolphin, something going very fast, but it's also an anchor, which is something solid. So there was apparently a sign above Aldus Manutius's workshop, print shop, that says, hurry and work slowly, or something like that. It was like a complete oxymoron, but it sort of made sense in the print world. So we'll just continue.
In about the year 1452, the actual date of his birth is a matter of some debate. That's about when Gutenberg was beginning to experiment with printing with movement.
And so when you look, 1452, 1453 is the year that Constantinople fell. So if you go back to your birth year, my birth year is 1975, that was actually when the Vietnam War stopped. So it's sort of like putting yourself into like what's happening in the secular realm. Aldus, the year that he was born, a year later, Constantinople fell. And so it's interesting to think of it in those terms, because in his lifetime, he would have seen a lot of change. And they were worried that the Ottoman Turks were going to come and overtake Europe. And so they were trying to rattle up armies in Rome. And Venice was very big in defending Constantinople as well. They were sending armies there. So they were constantly going back and fighting there as well. So it's interesting to know the history of that. So basically, having those 2 points where it's like, okay, and also around that time, the Gutenberg press was formulated. And so understanding the fall of Constantinople, the Gutenberg press, and the birth of Aldus Manutius, and he died just between the Complutensian Polyglot edition and Erasmus's first edition. And so it gives you a bit of a perspective of what was going on in that time period.
Movable type. He spent his early years studying in Rome and Ferrara, and Ferrara at the time was the real seat of classical learning. It was not Venice. He came into the circle of such renowned Greek scholars as Battista Guarino, and eventually got a plum job as a tutor, a private tutor, to the young princes of Carpi, Alberto and Leonello Pio. This is a relatively good life. lived in aristocratic surroundings, didn't have to worry about where his next meal came from. He corresponded widely with classical scholars of the day. This is sort of what 15th century tenure looked like. This was a good gig. It gave him the freedom to focus on his studies. He was not the image of the poor, starving scholar that sometimes we have in our mind. But in about the year 1490, and again, the exact date is uncertain, at the ripe old age of about 40, which was old in 1490, he made a rather radical decision to abandon that life of scholarly leisure and leap into the cutthroat and unforgiving world of printing. And I know today we think of printing as this gentlemanly and gentlewomanly profession. In the 1490s, the late 15th century, it was anything but. There's really no copyright law. It was cutthroat. It was expensive. The cost of paper, the cost of type were such that there are reams of studies about printers, particularly in Venice in the 15th century, who printed one book and it bankrupted them. One book. The first, by the way, was Johann Gutenberg. This was a really, really tough business. It's a radical decision on behalf of Aldus until you begin to read his own words about why he made the decision that he made. We conclude quickly that Aldus saw this new technology of printing as simply an extension of teaching. And furthermore, a technology that would allow him to teach more than just the two young privileged princes of Carpi. In other words, printing was a means to an end for Aldus. And I think it's not coincidental that some years later, his friend Erasmus, who lived with Aldus in 1508, can you imagine those dinner conversations? Erasmus said, you know, this fellow Aldus, all he's doing is building a library without walls. What an iconic image, and it's one that I think probably sprang from Aldus himself. So, in about 1490, Aldus packed his bags and he moved to Venice. The nice thing about Venice is it really doesn't change. Having collected the Aldine press and studied the era and knowing what Venice looked like in the Renaissance, the first time I went to Venice, I didn't need a map. Doesn't really change. I mean, it's a nice city in that regard. This is the famous map of Venice printed by Jacopo de Barbari. It's woodcuts. It's an extraordinary thing. It's about 4.5 feet tall, 9 feet wide. Actually, it's probably about that size. 6 wood blocks, 6 giant wood blocks from which this map is printed. And the blocks still survive in the Correr Museum in Venice, just off the Piazza di San Marco. Aldus's first press was established at San Agostino and subsequently in San Paterni, in 2 different locations of the press, and these are close-ups from the Barbary map. The first location still survives. You can go to it today. It's a private residence, but it's this yellow stucco building here, and it's hard to see, but there's actually a plaque on the wall in Italian, obviously, that reads, "In this house that belonged to Aldus Pius Manutius, the Aldine Academy gathered, and from here the light of Greek letters returned to shine upon civilized people."
And so notice he mentioned the Aldine Academy. And so that's one of the reasons why I've called this the Byzantine school. And so sometimes it gets called, you know, a group of scholars who are Byzantine, people working on the Byzantine text. It gets called an academy. But ultimately, just the Byzantine school is one of the reasons why I've called these series of videos that. And so this is after the Aldine Academy. So what we really want to do is get into the mind of Aldus Manutius. We want to get into the mind of Erasmus and who they knew and what they knew and what manuscripts they were looking at. And, you know, so this is just sort of like a start of a series on this.
You feel like standing at attention when you stand in front of the plaque. So this was the first location. The second location was destroyed in the 19th century in the name of progress, of course, and a rather modern bank building stands on its day. It's very depressing. That's the second site. That bank, I can't remember what bank it is. It's probably out of business by now. Looks out onto the Campo Manin, now called the Campo Manin. But if you do this, if you're ever there, if you walk up to the front of the bank and put your back to the bank and look out into the square, the rest of the square is relatively unchanged. This is, on a cloudy day or a shady day, what Aldus would have seen as he stood on the front doorstep of his second location. Venice was not an accidental destination. There was intent behind that. It was a commercial hub. And unlike much of the rest of Europe as it was at the day, it was a city in which wealth was not determined by how much land or livestock you owned. Because, duh, Venice, there is no land and precious little land for livestock. It was built by commerce. Merchants ruled the city. I think a guy wrote a play about that once, a few hundred years ago. There was already a robust center of printing in Venice, robust enough that Venice had already experienced several booms and busts, very similar to what we went through in 1999. New technology, a lot of money comes into it, the profits aren't there, the money comes back out again. Venice had gone through this 2 or 3 times prior to Aldus's arrival. Perhaps more importantly, after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, a diaspora of Greek speakers, readers, and scholars, along with their manuscripts, the raw material that Aldus needed, left Constantinople and settled in Venice.
Okay, so this is what I was saying before. You had Constantinople, which was the headquarters. Basically, this was, it's named after Constantine. You have Rome, then you have Constantinople, the east and the west. You have the capital of the Byzantine Empire and the capital of the Roman Empire. And so this one, imagine if Rome fell, where would all the Vatican Library things end up? Like imagine if they all had to run to England or something like that. And so what we see is they were taking their documents with them and they took them to Venice. So not only is it, it's very important that these scholars went there because they're taking their knowledge, their understanding, their learning, and even if they didn't have the books, just the knowledge and understanding that they had was very important for people's understanding of the Greek language. But they were bringing their manuscripts. They were bringing documents. They were bringing, sometimes their icons and things like that had certain engravings, pictures and paintings and things. So it's very important.
Essentially the first stop on the boat. They got off. And so Venice became the new Constantinople, the new Athens in some way, as a center for the Greek community. Again, the right people, Aldus and the Greeks, in the right place at the right time, a generation beyond the diaspora from Constantinople. So Aldus arrives in Venice about 1490, and the earliest evidence we have of him being there is a book, a curious little publication entitled the Musarum Panegyris. It is a whopping 7 leaves.
Okay, so I'll just go back to that. To the Greeks, the muse gave genius and well-rounded speech. They sought nothing but glory. You should turn these Greek models in your hands both day and night. And so this is his first book, which was 7 pages. And Scullery has asked, is this related to ancient biblical manuscripts? Well, basically, there was a huge shift between manuscripts and printing. So usually, people are like, where was the Bible before 1611? It's like, well, a new technology came on the scene called printing, where you could gather, 50 manuscripts and look at them all and work out exactly what it should say, and then put it into one principal edition, one printed text, and make 10,000 copies of it. And so this was new technology. It was like the internet. And so basically the amount of New Testament manuscripts that were in the Byzantine church, a lot of those manuscripts ended up in Venice and ended up in Rome and Florence and all throughout Europe. And so Erasmus, many of the libraries of Europe were getting these manuscripts. And if you've just been exiled from Constantinople, you'll sell these Bibles, documents to libraries, and they want to buy them. And so, but basically what we're looking at is the formation of the Byzantine school. So eventually we're going to be looking at the biblical manuscripts. We're going to be looking at, but Aldus wasn't just printing biblical manuscripts. And so he was also, I'll just grab his Wikipedia here. If we look at the books that he made, so these are Greek editions. All of these, so it goes through by date, 1494, and then right up till 1515. And so he was doing all sorts of Greek books, but then he was also doing Latin classics as well, and also humanist works. And so, yeah, the thing is, a lot of these people were so well known in this time. Like, say, Adagase. We know Adagase through Erasmus. But what I really want to do with this Byzantine school is I want to know what that is. I want to look at it. I want to see the manuscripts of it, and I want to see where it is today. And because Adagase is over 3,800, I think it is, or 3,260, sorry, Greek proverbs. So that's a huge work. And so understanding the scholarship of Desiderius Erasmus helps us with understanding how he came to the conclusions that he did when it comes to Greek grammar, when it comes to Latin grammar, when it comes to him making certain textual decisions, knowing that he had read all of these. He was proofreading about the time of 1508. So perhaps he worked on some of these works here as he was living with Aldus for 9 months. Perhaps they worked on these ones. And so we have Aristotle, Aratus, the history of the Peloponnesian War, Virgil, Horace, a lot of things that people would know, Julius Caesar. So, yeah, I would actually like to go through and look at all these, but we have to sort of lay some groundwork first. So anyway, let's just continue in that.
Darum Panegyris. It is a whopping 7 leaves. It barely aspires to pamphlethood. It's not published by Aldus, not printed by Aldus. Actually, there's no publisher's name in it, although the typography is a clue to who printed it. Battista de Tortis, probably around 1490. There's only one copy of this book in North America, and it's about 2 miles from here at the Morgan Library. What it basically is it's a letter from Aldus to the mother of his young pupils, Alberto and Leonello Pio. And in this book, he talks about how important a classical education is, and if you're going to be a well-rounded citizen and understand how the government and the democracy that we have now, form of democracy, was inherited from the Greeks and the Romans, this is something that you have to wrestle with. And he actually says, and I think this passage is very important, what I put in the red box here, he talks about how important it is to have these models of Roman and particularly Greek literature, so that you may, in his words, turn them in your hands day and night, breathe them, live them. It's a funny tract because on one hand, you ask yourself, why would you write this letter to the mother of, by now, your former students, because you've moved on to other things in Venice? I think what we read here is essentially a calling card. It's a mission statement. It's very close to being a business plan for why Aldus went to Venice. Because even though he encourages people in this opening line here that I put in the boxes to have these models and turn these Greek models in your hand day and night, there's only one problem. That may have been good advice, but it was impossible to carry through on that recommendation. There weren't books printed in Greek, very few books printed in Greek. It's a difficult language to print. And here is where we see Aldus, the teacher, come to the fore. How Aldus comes into the business as an extension of his genuine passion for teaching. What do you print? What do you do with your printing press if you want to evangelize the study of and the reading of Greek? The first thing you have to do is you have to teach people to read Greek, because very, very few people did. And so the earliest publications of the press were the grammars and the dictionaries, concordances, thesauruses, basically the working scholarly material that you would need as a Greek scholar, but also need if you were going to learn Greek yourself. This image is the opening page of the Erotemata by Constantine Lascaris, printed in 1495, one of the very first books printed by the press. And what you see, I mean, it's very simple. It's just the Greek alphabet. Let's start at the very beginning: alpha, beta, gamma, the most basic of instruction manuals. Latin was a very widely read language among the scholarly community. And so Aldus quite often would print text in parallel, sometimes line by line, sometimes page by page. This is the same book, the Lascaris' Erotemata, the opening of it. And what you see is the same text, Greek on the verso of the page and Latin on the recto. That's Latin on the recto of the page. Taking that pedagogical idea a step further, Aldus would sometimes print interlinear translations using very familiar texts that his audience would be familiar with. So the Lord's Prayer, what do we have here? Yeah, the Salve Regina, the Pater Noster. I mean, things that people would know almost by memory. And by virtue of seeing them in Latin, the language they could read, and seeing them interlinearly in Greek, it was a way to learn the language. This is Loeb classical texts, folks, in 1495. It's the same kind of idea that we still use today to teach languages. Dictionaries as well, 1497. You basically could have built a bookshelf of what you needed to read Greek by the end of the 15th century by buying the books that Aldus printed. Aldus also commissioned grammars. I have a sneaky feeling that he was a perfectionist. And so he would print a grammar and try to find a better one and try to find a better one. And in this one, he actually commissioned from a Franciscan friar named Urbano Valeriani. And the preface to this is delightful. The preface is written by Valeriani. It's very short. And in it, Valeriani basically says, and I'm paraphrasing, but only slightly, here's your damn book, get off my back already. I mean, I can sense Aldus, texting him every day, where's my book, where's my book? And what you see here is an architecture of the Greek alphabet. Again, this is Aldus thinking, how do I communicate this to an audience? This is the breakdown of how the consonants and the vowels and the diphthongs relate to each other.
So this is all very important in a sense where this is how Erasmus most probably learnt his Greek, through people like Aldus. Reuchlin, he is another figure that we're going to look at in this series. Now, Reuchlin was an expert in the Hebrew language. He was actually demonized by Rome because they thought that he was, because when you're getting into the Hebrew language, you have to get into the Rosicrucian type of thing, or the Kabbalah and the Talmud. And so people saw these as evil, wicked, but he was just interested in the language. But they demonized him as dabbling into the occult and all this sort of stuff. But it's actually the Reuchlinian language method that we would see used today that's called Erasmerian. The Erasmerian one was actually the native way of speaking. And so, but he was Aldus. He was writing these, going through, the alphabet and going through the grammatical issues, going through diphthongs and letters that are joined together and what sound that they make, and the phonetics of the Greek alphabet. So one thing about the Greek alphabet is that it took about 1,000 characters. So this is why it didn't get printed straight away. They were printing Latin, they were printing English works and a few other things, but then when it came to the Greek, they had to have 1,000 letters made because of all the accent, breathing marks, rough breathing, smooth breathing, all the issues that come with the Greek. It just took a long time for them to sort of get to the point where they could have 1,000 letters. And you imagine like trying to go through a drawer of these letters, and they're all backwards. So you're holding them in front of a mirror, trying to figure out which letter you're going to use. It would have been, it took a long time. And so when people mock, Erasmus for having some errors in his text, and even Aldus. Aldus was very good at this. But when people mock errors and things like that, it's like they just simply don't realize how hard it was to do this type of work. This was painstaking. It's so much easier just to grab your pen and copy it down, but to have to print it is next level.
It's a page almost certainly printed as a wood block, the sort of the flow charts and the lines with metal type set into the wood, and then printed. This is design in action, but it's designed for a specific pedagogical reason. The demand for these books was quite high. Evidence of that is pretty sketchy. It's subjective, but in this case, there's pretty good evidence. There is a letter that exists, correspondence from Erasmus to a friend in 1499, who complained that he was unable to find a copy of this book at any price. In 1499, the book was printed in 1497. So clearly, there was a demand for these materials. What followed was a dizzying array of Greek texts that these newly educated readers could now finally turn in their hands day and night. And this is how Aldus saved Western civilization, or at least the Greek part of it, and that's a pretty big part of it. And it needed saving. This was a language that was genuinely in danger of dying out. The story starts a little bit before Aldus. The first person that we know as a Greek teacher in Italy was Manuel Chrysolaris. He arrived in Florence in 1397 as a Greek teacher. He was the only one. It was a newly established chair of Greek studies at the university there. And Leonardo Bruni, in a letter about his arrival, noted that, quote, "There are plenty of teachers of the civil law, so that you will always be able to study that." How things have changed, right? But this is the one and only teacher of Greek. If he should disappear, there would be nobody from whom you could learn, end quote. Indeed, there are almost certainly more people on the face of the planet today that can read ancient Greek than there were in 1494 when Aldus began printing. And much of the literature had already been lost, even as of the 15th century. Through contemporary references and other works, we know what did exist, and of course we know what does exist, and the gap between the two is striking. Sophocles wrote over 120 plays, of which we have 7. Euripides wrote about 90 plays, of which we have 19, and we are led to believe by contemporary reference that the 19 we have are not the best ones that he wrote. Aristophanes, the best preserved of comedic playwrights, 32 lost plays. Aristotle, fortunately, we possess a great deal of what Aristotle wrote, but we've still lost half of everything that Aristotle ever wrote. This keeps classicists up at night, wondering what could have been. It is my contention that the robust application of this new technology of printing with movable type, particularly in Greek, and Aldus's contribution in particular, is directly responsible for this analysis not being worse. He was part of a tradition, and he was proud to be part of a tradition. I've mentioned Manuel Chrysolaris. He was very well received, and upon his return, he went back to Constantinople. In 1403, he took students with him, sort of study abroad, a la early 15th century. Most notably a student by the name of Guarino Guarini. And then when Guarino returned to Italy several years later, he began bringing back manuscripts from Greek studies. Among his students were Francesco Barbaro, Leonardo Giustiniani, and Vittorino da Feltri, each of whom could have a lecture of their own. Fascinating people. Vittorino da Feltri, in turn, taught Greek to George Trapezuntius, Theodore Gaza, and Nicholas Perotis, each of whom would wind up at some point or another working for the Aldine Press as an editor. And I mentioned that litany of names partially to impress you, but really to illustrate that there was a sort of apostolic succession that took place in Greek studies in the late 14th and throughout the 15th century. Who you learned from, and in turn, who you turned around and taught, was really important. It lent a sense of legitimacy. Oh, he studied under George Trapezuntius. That was if you will, a brand name. It was a thing. It exists today to some degree, but in Greek studies in the 15th century, it was desperately important. With all of this activity, with these apostolic successions, it's a little surprising that it took so long for books to be printed in Greek. And it was not a lack of source material. Manuscripts were everywhere. Robert Bulgar, in his book, The Classical Heritage and Its Beneficiaries, counts at least 1,400 Greek manuscripts present in Italy as of the end of the 15th century, representing no fewer than 89 different authors. The material was there. We know that Cardinal Bessarion gave his own collection of 482 Greek manuscripts to the Venetian people in 1468. And we know that because they are still in the Bibliotheca Marciana, where they have been since then. Printing had taken place in Latin and German, obviously, since the
So when you look at some of these names like Bessarion, if we just Google him, I'll just type in Greek manuscripts. Where are we? Cardinal Bessarion. Here we are. Whoops. Wikipedia. So usually when I'm going through on my website looking at Greek manuscripts, oftentimes it'll come up and say, well, Bessarion owned this manuscript or whatever. So it might even have a list of manuscripts. No, it doesn't go into that type of detail here on Wikipedia, but sometimes these guys had, like, I think they just said there was like 400, between 400 and 500 books that he donated to Venice, and they're still there today. So that is like a full wealth of understanding of that time, and also it's biblical manuscripts. And what we've got to understand too is someone like Manetti. Manetti did a Greek-based Bible. He did a Greek-based Bible, but he did a Latin translation. So this was the first complete Latin New Testament done based on Greek manuscripts since the time of Jerome. And so this is 70 years before Erasmus. And so just as much as we can look at the King James and look at the textual decisions that they've made and understand the underlying Greek text, well, you can look at Manetti's Latin and go, well, he had Greek manuscripts that had these readings. So this is quite interesting. Like, say, in Revelation chapter 1, verse 8, he doesn't have the word God there, which is a Textus Receptus unique reading where it doesn't have God there. And so this is the type of thing where people are going back to Erasmus and oftentimes accusing him of doing things. Well, oftentimes Erasmus was looking at Manetti, looking at Bessarion, looking at Lorenzo Valla, and reading their material as well. And so he had access to all their material. And so, and the thing is, it's so much different being fluent in like the Greek language to be able to go through and read Bessarion's manuscripts. And like, imagine if they were all in English, you could go back through and just read through them. See, scholars today, they're like, oh, well, I can read these languages. They're with, their iPhone, they're with a thesaurus, they're with a lexicon and a dictionary, and then they're struggling through it, where Erasmus could read it fluently. He's a proofreader for the Greek language in the Aldine press. And so this is impressive learning. This is impressive scholarship. And so, but I might even type in, so obviously these guys are like, they're part of the Byzantine groups, they're part of the Roman Catholic groups. I'm not, advocating for their spirituality at all. I'm just talking about their scholarship. And so, because most of Europe was under the sway of Rome, there wasn't, people who bucked at that. They were usually burnt. They were usually killed. I mean, look at even Wycliffe. 30 years after he died, they dug up his bones and burnt them. It's bizarre, but that's what the Roman Catholics would do. So I'll just type in Bessarion manuscripts Bible. manuscripts in the Bibliotheca Marciana. Okay. And so I wrote Bible there. But it's picking up Bibliotheca. Okay. So even under Codex Vaticanus, that mentions Bessarion. It has been postulated the Codex was at one time in the possession of Cardinal Bessarion. So this is very interesting. This is Codex Vaticanus. So this is the thing. If we learn about these guys back then, I think we really need to study someone like Cardinal Bessarion and everything that he had. Because if he had Codex Vaticanus, Erasmus came to the conclusions about Codex Vaticanus for a reason. He didn't just pull it out of thin air. He would have studied Bessarion's material. And so I'll just read through this. It says, it is postulated that the Codex the Vaticanus was at one time in the possession of Cardinal Bessarion because the manuscript supplement has a similar text to one of Bessarion's manuscripts. T.C. Skeet believed Bessarion's mentor, the patriarchal notary in Constantinople, John Cortesmenos, be an interesting guy to look into, had the book brought to Rome from Constantinople around the time of the fall of the Byzantine Empire. So they're saying that could have come from Byzantium, from Constantinople. Paul Kangart argued the decorative details added to the manuscript in the Middle Ages are reminiscent of the Constantinopolitan decoration found in the 10th century, but the poor execution gives the impression that they were added in the 11th or 12th century and not likely before the 12th century, in light of the way they appear in connection with notes in a minuscule hand at the beginning of the book of Daniel. T.C. Skeet first argued that Codex Sinaiticus was among the 50 Bibles that the Emperor Constantine I ordered Eusebius of Caesarea to produce. So that's a whole different issue, but I just thought I'd mention, someone like Bessarion is like, in his day, he was like another Erasmus type of guy. He was like another Aldus. He was, this is obviously before the age of printing, but I'm not sure when he died. Okay, 1472. So Aldus would have been like 20 years old. But yeah, so he would be another very interesting guy to look into. And even the guys who did the Complutensian Polyglot, it would be great to look into them and into their scholarship. So Scullery says that's what Putin thinks. I guess, the East and West never meeting. Jeshron says both the KJV and Douay Reams use the Latin Vulgate as a source. Okay. I don't think the KJV used it as a source. I think they just used the Greek of Theodore Beza. But so this John Cortesmenos, Byzantine monk, and so that he died in 1439. So he would have known Calicus probably and other people who have mentioned the Commiahanium. So be interesting to go through the material. Anyway, I'll shut those down and we'll just continue back on. But he just mentioned Bessarion in passing. He mentioned a bunch of other names, and he's sort of like, it gets to the point where you're going back in that era. And it's like, this guy's a legendary scholar. This other guy is too. This other guy is too. And it's like, he's saying, I'm saying these names to impress you. But if you don't know who these guys are, it's not really that impressive. But they are huge names regardless of whether they were steeped in Roman Catholicism. I mean, obviously, the Complutensian Polyglot, these guys were pretty rad. And their whole concept of the Spanish Inquisition, Erasmus got invited to work on the Complutensian Polyglot, and he's like, well, I don't like Spain. I think he just thought, I don't want to get burnt at the stake, because he'd actually said one of the popes had gone to hell and written a play about it. It's like, so anyway.
the mid-1450s. The first printed books in French and in Czech were in the 1460s. Italian and Hebrew were in the 1470s. English and Spanish in 1474. So 20 years into the era of printing with movable type, no complete book had been printed in Greek. The first book to hold that distinction is a grammar, not surprisingly, the Greek grammar of Constantine Lascaris. Interestingly, not a classical text, but a grammar, printed in 1476. That's the first book in Greek, almost 25 years after Gutenberg. So prior to Aldus's arrival in Venice in the 1490s, less than a dozen books had been printed in Greek. Why? Why this mystery? How many of you read Greek? Okay. It's a really difficult language. It's a beautiful one. You should try it. But it's a really difficult language, particularly when you compare it to Latin, a language in which many books had been printed. The Latin alphabet has 23 letters. There's no J, U, or W in Latin. Easy enough. The Greek alphabet has 24 letters with, of course, both upper and lower cases. But here's where the story gets complicated. And keep in mind, we're talking about printing with movable type. So each of these individual sorts has a form of its own. So take a look at take a quick look at the 7 Greek vowels. 7, first of all, versus 5 in Latin. There are more toppings to these vowels than you would find in an ice cream store. Omega. At the beginning of a Greek word, most vowels, omega and most other vowels, either take a hard breathing mark or a soft breathing mark that signifies whether the vowel is aspirated with an H sound at the beginning or unaspirated, a soft breathing mark. Furthermore, Greek is a tonal language. It has accents, acute, grave, and circumflex accents. And ancient Greek was probably spoken in a way that had a very musical quality to it. We don't know, of course, but there's some hints of that in the text. And then finally, when certain Greek vowels are followed by the other Greek vowel, iota, or I, the iota sort of scoots underneath the vowel and becomes a subscript. And of course, all these variations apply to capital omega as well. So I'll do the math for you. If cast separately, that is 30 different sorts for the letter omega alone. All Greek vowels can take breathing marks and accents, and alpha, eta, and omega can furthermore assume these iota subscripts. So if you do that math on possible variations, that leads to 162 different sorts for Greek vowels alone. And we haven't yet dealt with consonants, ligatures, and combinations of letters and abbreviations.
And so I'm just going to quickly show you. I'll just go to my website first. And but if you just go to Google and just type in Greek alphabet, one of the best places to get the letters of the Greek alphabet is Wikipedia. They've done a really good job, and I'll frequently go here when I'm looking for the letters. So obviously you can sort of find the letters of the Greek alphabet everywhere. But they do have all the specialized little letters here. So if you go down the bottom of the page, so it'll explain, the history of the letters and, where they've appeared and all the rest of it. Earlier forms, Phoenician, and how they became the Greek, and, the history of the Greek alphabet. It's a very interesting page to go through. That looks like the Stephanus edition, but it's, I think that is this. Is it Stephanus? I'm not sure. Anyway, some of the minuscule way things were written. So sometimes if you're stuck on, you see a letter like this and you're like, is that a nu or a mu? And sometimes they were very similar. And that was one of the things with James Snap Jr.'s debate that I had yesterday. The mu and the nu sometimes in the papyri can look very similar. So you have to be fluent in Greek to really get down to those nuances. But what I really want to show you is down the bottom here. They have these. Okay, so this is Greek in Coptic. So basically the Coptic language just sort of borrowed the Greek alphabet, and they had a few little things of their own. Like some of these are pretty weird, and you usually wouldn't see these in a Greek document. But then it has the Greek extended, and so here you have all the different breathing marks. Yeah, so for the letter A, alpha, you've got the rough breathing mark, smooth breathing mark, all the acute symbols, capitalization, and then you go down the page and you have the letter A or alpha with the iota subscript underneath it. So it's very handy if you're actually trying to, if you're looking at a manuscript or what someone's written, and you're like, well, I need the iota subscript and I need the acute symbol above it. You'll find it here. So this has been very handy for me on my website, because sometimes the difference in like Stephanus's text and Beza's text can be the difference in the way that one letter, the acute symbol is facing one way on one letter and one way on the same letter. And so just making those little tiny distinctions can mean a lot to scholars. And so I've tried to make it so it's got all those little distinctions in there. So it's very handy to go to there. Now, he did mention ligatures, so I want to show you. Now, some of you have already know what this is, but obviously we get new people all the time. And so in my books section, I've got a link to ligatures of early printed Greek. Now, this is like a ligature, okay? So it's basically when you get 2, 3, 4, 5 letters and they're summed up in like a squiggly little like shorthand type of thing. And so probably one of the best letters to look at, or the best words to look at, is the K. And so you'll see all these type of forms in even printed editions, because this is ligatures of the early printed Greek. So this isn't even just manuscript Greek. You have some different ones. But what happened was, when they were going through and printing the Greek, they went through and they tried to make these ligatures exactly like the manuscripts. So that way, and you do see this, like if I open up, I'll just open up a Stephanus, okay. Bibles Online, I think it is. Bibles, yeah, online.net. They've got a whole bunch of Bibles you can go to. So we'll go to the 1550 Stephanus, because it's just like a wall of Greek, okay? We'll just go 1 Thessalonians, just for an example, a random type of page, okay? So we'll enlarge it. So you can see here, this after here, you got the alpha, the upsilon, the tau, and this here looks like a U with an O on it, or it sort of looks like a hook. That is actually an omicron and an upsilon. And so, and see, this is why some people, like the whole issue with James Snap and myself arguing about whether something was plural, their purification or her purification, it's exactly this type of wording, but it actually the ending of the wording was in an omega, not in a omicron. But you can see a ligature here. So the printed text is filled with these. This here is the way to write K, which is the word and. So 5% of the New Testament is the word and, which is the K. So this is one of those here. So I'll just match this up with that. So where did I see that K? I'll just make it bigger again. Here. So it looks like a KJ with a little line. Okay. So let's find it here. There it is, the KJ with a little line. And so it's some people, they're going through and trying to look at the Stephanus or the Beza text, and oftentimes it's like this. And so this can turn people off reading Greek, because you have to understand the ligatures as well. But see, this was something that Erasmus knew, and he knew that it's not just looking at familiar endings, homoioteiton, homoi, arcton, similar beginnings, which are all part of parablepsis. It wasn't just, like seeing an O at the end of a letter and thinking, well, the other letter, at the end of a word, and going, well, that's where the scribe skipped a line. A lot of people are trying to figure that out, looking at modern printed texts that are in computer typesetting, where you have to really look. This is in printed, and so you can see where people could have, homoiateton here, but obviously it's going to happen in the manuscripts. And so it's not only just knowing the printed text with all its oddities, with all of its nuances, but it's knowing the manuscripts as well. So say this letter here, it looks like an omicron, but it's actually a P. It's a PROS. That says pros there, pros umas, from us. And so, but people could mistakenly see that as a omega. I think I said omicron, an omega. So you got pros here as well, pros, ton, theon, apo. But then you got here, it's a ligature. And so understanding that these are very important, and that the people like Erasmus and Aldus, that they were dealing with this every day. And so to be fluent in this type of language, to be fluent with the ligatures even, was very helpful for them. And so it was the next level scholarship.
Robert Proctor, the great student of typography of the late 19th century, tried to count the number of sorts in the early Greek type of Leonicus and Alexandros and gave up at 1,223 sorts. Can you imagine what that printer's case would have looked like? You begin to understand why.
So 1,223 different characters for the Greek. So no wonder it was hard to get that Greek printed. It took a while for things to really take off.
There was such a problem with printing in Greek. There were early attempts at Greek typography going all the way back to Mainz in 1465, very earliest days of printing. Schoeffer and Fust, neither of whom could read Greek, but wanted to accurately render six Greek words, rather, in Cicero's Paradoxica Stoicorum. And so they cast 9 Greek letters, not 1,226. They cast 9 Greek letters and then used Latin letters that kind of were close enough. So, for example, they used the Latin letter A to stand in for alpha. Yeah, okay, that probably worked. But they also used the letter A to stand in for delta and lambda as well. This is hardly an advance in Greek typography. Other printers simply didn't try. Swinem and Panarts, printing in Subiaco outside of Rome in 1465, just left blank spaces in the text and said, just go get someone to fill it in, which you could do. The owner of this text clearly did that. It wasn't long before printers.
It's interesting that in Theodore Beza's 1556 Latin, he actually has like the Hebrew sheen and seen letters, which look like a W to us with dots on the top of it. But he actually has them for names, like it might say Saul and it's like Shawl, but it just has the Hebrew letter, but then it has the rest in Latin. It's quite interesting that he did that.
Printers did begin casting basic Greek type, but they did it by just ignoring the diacriticals, they ignored the accents, they ignored the breathing marks. It was close enough. But for someone who was a native Greek reader, it was like reading a first or second grade primer. It was hardly an advance in Greek typography. And you'll see that they had borrowed from what came before. Each of the Greek letters was cast in its own sort of space. It looks very, very much like the Latin text that surrounds it. It's readable, but it's not terribly elegant. A further solution to the problem noted that the real complexity of Greek really exists in the lowercase letters. So why not just print everything in uppercase? The models for this were the monumental inscriptions. And if you've been to Greece, you've seen things that look like the middle part of this text here from buildings. It's not terribly elegant, and I think a reader would be hard-pressed to read an entire text of Greek capitals. And I have to confess, somewhat anachronistically, that as a 21st century reader familiar with electronic communication conventions, this text just looks like we're all being yelled at in ancient Greek. I'm not sure I could put up with that many capitals for that long. If the difficulty of creating the type was one reason that Greek printing didn't take off any earlier than it did, let me offer another. You're all familiar with the precept of Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually the best. Perhaps Greek printing was slow to develop simply because the demand wasn't there. And yet, how do we reconcile this with the fact that there was a robust and growing school of Greek studies in Florence, in Ferrara, in Rome, in Venice, really accelerating throughout the 15th century? The solution, I think, is that the demand for Greek text created their own supply, that the Greek community in Italy had such an enormous output of manuscripts that the demand for printing was simply slow to develop. As one example, consider a man named Demetrius Damilas, who printed that text I referred to, the first complete Greek text in 1476, the Erotemata of Constantine Lascaris. In his day, Damilas was not considered a printer. He was considered a scribe. And to this day, there is something in the neighborhood of 50 Greek manuscripts in his hand. He was a scribe by profession. The scribal tradition in Greek was alive and well throughout the 15th century, half a century into the era of printed type. And indeed, the last we hear of Damilas, his last appearance in the historical record, is in 1506, where he's taking a job at the Vatican as a scribe, not as a printer. He printed a book and said, too newfangled, I'm going to go back and do it the old-fashioned way. Greek readers relied on familiar and trustworthy hands. I've referred to this apostolic succession of scholarship. The physical expression of that was the handwriting of individual Greek scholars. A text in a known hand not only carried the legitimacy of the scribe, but it also carried authority as well. So as of 1490, the state of Greek culture was still very reliant on this apostolic succession and the way it found its expression in the manuscript traditions.
And I think one thing that can irk me, or has irked me in the past, is sometimes you'll be going through manuscript evidence and people put, this is a 16th century manuscript, it's a 17th century manuscript, it's an 18th century manuscript. And then what happens is people on the critical text side turn around and go, oh, that's obviously copied from a printed text. And, I thought the same thing. But oftentimes it's people like Bruce Metzger who are writing this information. And so someone on the King James side, they're just copying Metzger's. They copy and paste it, and then they're scolded for that information. But there's another side to that where a lot of the printing presses, like you just saw, it took over 1,200 characters to actually have a fully functioning Greek alphabet. Okay, a lot of the printing presses couldn't afford this throughout the Greek Empire, and so the Greek-speaking churches and things like that. So they still use scribes. So some of these works were still copied from older manuscripts. So there is a flip side of that, where having something written in the 1700s, it might not have been influenced by printed text. It might have just been influenced by older manuscripts. And sometimes we see too, like specifically with the Jews, with their manuscripts, we see even today there are people who copy the Masoretic text. This is their whole occupation. They just constantly go through and copy the Hebrew, and they're doing it today. Obviously, I'm talking about influence from printed text and things like that. But in the Byzantine era and after the age of printing, some of these groups were still doing the same type of work that had been done for hundreds of years. Some of these scriptoriums never closed down, and some of these monks are still doing this today. And so that all has to be taken into consideration. So we can't just look at something and go, oh, well, that's 16th century, 17th century, oh, well, we just scrapped that. No, we've got to weigh whether it is from a printed text or not. If it's not, it could be a representative of a 10th century manuscript, So we've just got to be careful that we are not just throwing things out or keeping things in. We've got to look at both sides of the coin. But yeah, it is good to note that the printing press didn't take off everywhere. Not everyone could afford to go to Venice and get their stuff printed, or to Paris or wherever they set up Greek printing presses. And it's interesting too that when you look at the claims of Simonides with Codex Sinaiticus, he said that he, with his uncle Benedict, had made Sinaiticus so that they could get a grant from the Russian Tsar to have a printing press. So, we're looking at 1840, around then, that people, 400 years after the invention of printing, still that they can't afford the printing press because it costs so much money. And so this has affected scribes as well, if what he says is true,
So enter Aldus, and here I think was Aldus's real insight as both a businessman and as a humanist. The secret of his success was that he co-opted the manuscript tradition, or at least the look and the feel of the manuscript tradition in his early Greek fonts. And the way he did that is he based his fonts not only on Greek handwriting, but on the handwriting of known Greeks. So the first font that he used, this is the 1495 undated, probably 1495 Musaeus. That's on the right. That's a printed book. On the left is the handwriting of a Greek scholar named Emmanuel Rosotus. And the typography is based on that hand. Now we've got a full expression. We've got breathing marks. We've got accents, subscripts, ligatures, abbreviations. It's actually quite a complicated typography. And indeed, it's no wonder that it took Aldus's type designer, punch cutter, Francesco Griffo, about 6 years to pull this font together. Aldus arrives in Venice in about 1490, the first publication of the press in 1495. That's a lot of work that went into that. The 1498 Aristophanes, in a very similar type, a different type, but similarly based on the hand-script of Emmanuel Rosotus. And here the real advancement, and this gets a little bit into the weeds, but I think it's fascinating. Here, the advancement in typography that Aldus and Francesco Griffo, his type cutter, came up with was the ability to imply both vertical and horizontal kerning. So you no longer needed to cast individual pieces of type for every possible detailed expression of a Greek font. And this audience probably knows this, but here's an example of that. The Greek letter alpha with a smooth breathing mark where the accent, the breathing mark rather, and the vowel are actually two different sorts. So now I don't need a separate sort that's the alpha rough breathing, alpha smooth breathing. I can begin to simplify my life a little bit. This image is from Philip Gaskell's New Introduction to Bibliography, standard text. I'm sure it's in the library here. A third Greek font was based on the hand of Marcus Musurus, one of Aldus's frequent editors of the Aldine Press, here shown next to the 1502 Editio Princeps of Herodotus. It's still pretty complicated. When the exhibition was up at the Grolier Club, and these books were all in cases where you could stand rather close to them, I had a visiting class of graduate students and professors from the Fordham University Department of Classics come, and I challenged them to approach the case and try to read the Greek. If you are a fluent reader of ancient Greek, this is really hard Greek to read. Again, because it's based on handwriting. Try to read the handwriting of someone writing in English in 1502, and it would be similarly difficult. The final fourth and final Greek type that Aldus used, he based.
So this is why it's so important to understand the history of Erasmus, that he grew up as an Augustinian monk. And the Augustinians many times were copying manuscripts. So he was copying Latin documents, and he could tell when there was a bad text. He could tell when he was copying something that there was an error. And so he firsthand, he knew this. And Erasmus knew what it was like to be a scribe. He knew what it was like to be a proofreader in Aldus Manutius in his print shop, because he worked with this guy for 9 months. So when Scott Clemens is saying that it's really difficult to read this ancient Greek and all the rest of it. That's the type of Greek that Erasmus could read, and so that's next level. He could read every type of Greek. He could read the printed, he could read the handwritten stuff, he could read the ancient handwritten stuff, and so that's very important to know that, because obviously, as we just saw with the ligatures and things like that, things can change, things can morph. Someone can mistakenly think that it's an omega, where it's actually a pi, or it's with a line on it is at a nomina sacra, sort of thing, and so they knew this type of thing like the back of their hand. So this is where people today many times struggle with knowing this. They might be able to look it up and zoom things in and go, well, what's this, and figure it out like it's a Sudoku puzzle or something. But it's way different for someone like Erasmus to go through and just read the text, say it out in Greek, and know exactly what it's saying. That's next level. And so that was one of the things I was trying to bring across yesterday in the debate, that I just don't think James Snap Jr. I just don't trust that he knows as much as these guys, And we're just looking at the beginnings with Aldus and with Erasmus. Obviously it goes on to Collinnaeus and Stephanus and Tremellius and Janius and Theodore Beza and the King James guys, and it moves on. That this is just the foundation of works like the Textus Receptus, because Aldus was the first one to ever print scripture. He printed 6 chapters of the book of John. It would be actually very interesting to look at those chapters, if they're still available, and see how they line up with the Textus Receptus. That would be very interesting. Or if he actually printed from chapter 1, because he might have even put the Bricobae Adulterae in there. Be interesting, anyway, to look at that.
On his own handwriting. That's his handwriting on the left, and that's the Aldine Sophocles from 1502 on the right. Again, maybe a little hint of Aldus as the perfectionist. Nobody can do it the way I can do it. Stand aside. I'll take it from here. The typography becomes a little bit more standard. It's a little bit more readable. And whether we have Francesco Griffo, his punch cutter, or Aldus himself to thank for this is a matter for further research. It is safe to say that later critics of typography were not so kind to Aldus's innovations. I wax poetic about this, but I got a dog in the fight. Some of the typographical analysts of the 20th century didn't find it very appealing. No less than the great Robert Proctor, in his printing of Greek in the 15th century, dismissed the Aldine Greek, accusing the font of, and I quote, an absence of dignity and a restlessness expressed in the want of restraint in the voluminous curves, the endless variety in the size and the form of the letters, and an incredible complexity of abbreviation which makes the deciphering of a Greek text no small difficulty to the inexperienced, end quote. Tell us what you really believe, Robert. Kurt Buehler shared this opinion in the 1950 monograph in the Papers of the Bibliographical Society of America. I quote again, his press work was indifferent. His types were poor. It has been said, I believe with all possible justification, that his Greek types set back the study of that tongue by 300 years, end quote. Finally, Martin Lowry, writing in 1979 in his book, The World of Aldus Manutius, quote, this is my last quote on this, but it remains true that unless he is a skilled paleographer or well acquainted with the text that he has to hand, the modern reader who attempts to study an Aldine Greek text will soon experience a prickling in the eyes and a woolly sensation behind them, end quote. Not a whole lot of love. Who am I to disagree with Messrs. Proctor and Buehler and Lowry? Well, I'm not only a bookman, I'm a businessman. And I think the insight into Aldus's typographical choice was a business decision as much as it was a humanist decision. To borrow the look and feel of a humanist hand was to access this very long tradition of Greek literature, and it made the transition into a new world of printing comfortable, accessible, and marketable. The average duration of a printing press in Venice around the year 1500 was about 18 months. From opening to bankruptcy, 18 months. The Aldine Press printed its first book in 1495 and didn't close its doors until Aldus's grandson died in 1597. 102 years versus an 18-month average. He figured something out. And what I think he figured out was how to make technological change accessible. I think the opinions of some of these early typographers are 20th century aesthetics applied to a 15th century challenge. It's my belief that economics and marketing drove Aldus's innovations in typography as much as the aesthetics of the day. The type just looked familiar. That familiarity carried legitimacy and trust. Aldus understood something profound about the human condition. We are creatures of habit. We do not like change. Technological change, in particular, is frightening. Borrowing from previous traditions helps to ease that change. This happened not just in Greek. Beyond his contributions to Greek typography and printing, Aldus was also responsible for significant advances in types much more familiar to us today. In 1495, Aldus published this book. It was a contract printing. It wasn't a classical text. A friend of his, Pietro Bembo, took a trip with his dad to visit Mount Etna. And they had a pleasant time, and they came back, and Bembo said, I'd like to have a little, memory of that. Would you print it? And Aldus said, if you're writing the checks, I'll print the book. But he printed it in a newly designed type, again, by Francesco Griffo. And as you can see, this is a very familiar look. So familiar, in fact, that the typeface Bembo, which is named for this publication, is widely used today. And the designer and printer of my book, Jerry Kelly, in row 3, used his own variation of Bembo type, a new invention of Bembo type, to print the catalog for the exhibition. You'll also see in the second line of text, after the word angele, with a capital A, angele, a punctuation mark, semicolon. That's the first appearance of a semicolon in print. Aldus basically invented the semicolon as we use it today.
Okay, so that's interesting. I've sort of forgotten this, but because I'd just been, what was I subscribed to? Scribd. And they had an audio book, which was the semicolon. And so I'll just quickly look that up. File type. Okay, Scribd seems to have changed. I think it's gone to Everlast or something. So maybe I'll just type in semicolon book. Yeah, I think it's this one, the semicolon, past, present, and future. So that looks like quite a recent one. Yeah, 2019. So that would be it. Yeah, so I'll just have a quick look at this in Amazon, because I do remember they go through the history of how it started. Because in Greek, it means a comma. And so, but obviously he's in this section, he's showing in the Latin text, which means something different. And so there were some people saying that the semicolon is absolutely useless to the English language. And yeah, so it's an interesting book. And so I'll probably revisit that a little bit. And yeah, anyway, it's interesting that Aldus Manutius was the inventor of the semicolon.
How many punctuation marks have you invented? Oh, I didn't think so. So give a shout out for inventing a punctuation mark. Aldus's more acknowledged contribution to typography is the invention of what we now know as italic type. It makes its first appearance in a woodcut in the St. Catherine of Siena, printed in 1500, in just a few phrases, actually just 6 letters. The book that she holds in her right hand, the heart that she holds in her left, that's the very first appearance of italic type. It was an experiment. This is in September of 1500. The experiment worked. And by the following year, Aldus is printing books entirely in italic. This is the Virgil of 1501. It is the first book printed entirely in italic type. And a host of Latin texts, not Greek anymore, Latin text, followed in short order. Horace, Martial, Statius, Lucan, Catullus, etc., etc. Unlike the large, expensive Greek folios, those would have been expensive. They're expensive today. They would have been expensive back then. Aldus printed these in a smaller octavo format, a format he himself called libelli portatiles, his portable books. This was not innovative. Printers had printed in this octavo format in the past, but what they had printed were mostly devotionals. They were religious texts, books of hours, and things of that nature that were meant to be interacted with on a very personal basis. Once again, I believe Aldus just co-opted a tradition that already pre-existed and said, why shouldn't you have the ability to have a personal relationship with Virgil? And so starting in 1501, he basically made books accessible and portable for really the first time in history. Now, finally, going back to 1490 in the Musarum Panegyris, these are books that you can turn in your hands and hold and use both day and night. One of my favorite Aldine Latin octavos is the Caesar, printed in 1513. And it's favorite because anyone who's ever studied Latin knows that all of Gaul is divided into 3 parts. It's a classic text of how you learn Latin, and it was in 1513 as well. This book stands as further evidence of how Aldus simply saw printing as an extension of teaching. There is in the text a woodcut map of Gaul, of France, that's what you see here on the slide, which was hand-colored during production. This is not a process of printing. The text, the woodblock would have been printed, and then another maker would have gone back, probably with a stencil, and colored in the map, according to a code given in the preface. And using the color code and using the preface, the student can follow Caesar's campaigns around Gaul. This is a teacher at work. This is not someone printing a book for the sake of printing a book. This is someone who wants to educate. And again, we see Aldus as a perfectionist. There were 2 woodcuts of some of the battles of Caesar's campaigns, different fortifications. Those are flaming barrels of oil coming down the side. They're great woodcuts. But through an error in imposition, the woodcuts, when folded and stitched and sewn, did not fold up against the right text. So the text on the other side of the page was not the text that went with that woodcut. These are the kind of things that made Aldus furious. And so, deeply unhappy with this state of affairs, Aldus corrected the mistake in hand in every copy of the 1513 Caesar. That's Aldus's handwriting underneath the 2 woodcuts. Every copy of this book I've ever seen, some are more faded than others, has these corrections. I had this picture of Aldus sitting at his desk late at night, cursing under his breath at the compositor who made this happen. There's great debate about what prompted Aldus to design his italic type. And some scholars argue that because paper was so expensive, italic type was used because you could fit more words on a page. Factually, that's untrue. If you've ever set type and you set italic type and set Roman type, you don't save a whole lot of space. And furthermore, Aldus actually loved wide margins. You see some of the images of his books, and he had a real aesthetic sense of the way a page should look.
So this was actually the reasoning behind Nomina Sacra by James White. James White had made the claim that they used Nomina Sacra to save space, and I was like, no. Like when you look at Nomina Sacra in a lot of these documents, they've got margins that are huge, and so to save space, it just didn't make any sense. And what it shows is also his lack of understanding of the sacred names, the whole concept of sacred names that goes back to the name of Jehovah. And so Derek says, there are 3 sides to every coin: the heads, the tails, and the edge. Your ability to understand contrasting points of view and to glean valuable information from each is crucial So that was Robert Kiyosaki. Okay, so he's a rich dad, poor dad guy. Okay, that's an interesting quote. Thanks for that. Avery F says, paint by numbers, Latin edition. Yeah, remember those? Or I guess they're still around. You get the paintings and it says number 7, and you look up the list, and that's supposed to be this yellow paint, and you paint in that area number 7, and down here number 7, and yeah, that's really interesting. Pastor Brett says, is this fellow a teacher in your school? No, this Scott Clemens is just an expert on Aldus Manutius, and so he's got quite a lot to say about him. So some of what he's saying is very relevant to us with his relationship to Erasmus, but some of it is just talking about printing and things like that. But it's all very interesting.
Really wanted to save paper. He could have cut down on the margins. Instead, I think we see another example of how Aldus borrows from a previous tradition by mimicking the handwriting of his day. Italic script was meant to look like cursive script, the court hand of the day, in a way to make this new technology seem familiar, trustworthy, and comfortable. As an example of this dynamic, consider this image. This is a manuscript written in about 1490, so into the era of the printed book. It's a manuscript of Juvenal satires held at the Leeds University Library. So just look at the shape or the character of the page. You've got a running title on the top with the title of the book, Satira, Satires, and the chapter number, Roman numeral 10. Left justified. This is in manuscript. This is a manuscript, with the first letter of each line set off in a capital, followed by the line of verse. This is the Aldine imprint of the same text, Juvenal, done in 1501. The similarities just leap off the page at you. Same running title. We have the word decima instead of the Roman numeral 10. Individual lines set apart by a capital at the beginning, followed by, here's the classic italic type. This is not a coincidence. In my opinion, this is an explicit attempt, once again, to make this new technology familiar. And this is still happening, by the way. As we undergo paradigm shifts today in the electronic world still reaches back and borrows from the world of print to make the technology seem more accessible. If you go to the NewYorkTimes.com, there's a masthead on the screen in front of you. Why do you need a masthead on a computer screen? Because it's the New York Times, all the news that's fit to print. That lends a sense of legitimacy, of familiarity. It mimics, it echoes the earlier technology. It's why the camera on your iPhone clicks. There's no shutter on your iPhone. But somewhere in your lizard brain, you know that cameras are supposed to click, and so Steve made the camera click. I believe that Aldus's love of the classical tradition, the Greeks in particular, but Latin as well, coupled with this keen insight into human nature, made him the right man in the right place at the right time. The scholarly record speaks with equal conviction. When we look at the way text first found their way into print, there's a word that bibliographers use, editio princeps, and the Latin literally means first edition, but it stands for the first time a book escapes the vagaries of the manuscript tradition and finds its way into print. A manuscript can be lost. You print 300 copies of a book, it's going to stick around. You may lose half of them, but there's safety in the sheer numbers of that. The canon of Latin classics had already been established in print long before Aldus picked up a composition stick. As we've seen, however, very little had been printed in Greek. It took Aldus, with his love for Greek, an apparently inexhaustible supply of energy, and his dogged dedication to the classics to save the Greek part of the canon. Other than Homer, practically every Greek classic first found its way into print through the house of Aldus. From the Aristotle through the Greek historians, Herodotus, Thucydides, Strabo, the playwrights Euripides, Sophocles, Aeschylus, even the editio princeps of the Bible in Greek, the Septuagint, first printed by Aldus's heirs in 1516, the year after he died. In that counterfactual world where Aldus did not exist or did not go to Venice, when he did, some of these texts might have never found their way into print and become irretrievably lost. If this long list of Aldine contributions to the world of literature and the way in which these books were loved by collectors and scholars over the years isn't proof enough. Let Aldus himself have the final word. In the preface to his 1513 edition of Plato, the Editio Princeps, this is printed just a little more than a year before Aldus's death. In the preface to his readers, Aldus noted that, and I quote, "Some learned men consider me a modern-day Hercules, because ignoring all difficulties and dangers, I have rendered greater services to the cause of letters than any other person for many ages past. This has so far entitled me to their esteem that both in person and by letter they tire me out with their praise. But I don't believe them. Nor in truth have I ever yet published a book with which I have been pleased. Such is the regard which I bear to literature that I wish to render those books which are intended for the use of the learned not only as correct, but as beautiful as possible." End quote. A perfectionist. I will leave it to the judgment of you whether or not Aldus accomplished those twin goals of preserving Greek literature and culture in doing so in an elegant and aesthetically pleasing fashion. But I think you know where I stand. And with that, thank you for your attention this afternoon. I would be happy to take questions, but I do want to mention the exhibition that was at the Grolier Club earlier this year. It will have an online presence soon. So if you visit the Grolier Club website every once in a while, grolierclub.org, pretty straightforward, you can find it. Visit the club. It's open to the public, 60th between Park and Madison. You'll see a physical expression of this exhibit or electronic on the website soon. And then there's also the book, which you see over there, newly arrived on these shores. Members of the Grolier Club don't have this book yet because it just came in, Jerry, last week. Friday, right? Friday. So almost literally hot off the presses, and delightfully printed in a new typeface design for this book by Jerry, for which I'm eternally grateful. So it's available for sale. 141 items, fully illustrated. There are indices. There's all sorts of stuff like that in it as well. So with that, I will end, and I would be delighted to take any questions about anything that I have said or not said or should have said or should not have said. Yes, sir. So how did the story begin that the choice?
Can you imagine James Snap Jr. being in the audience? He's like, well, why are you a flat earther? You know. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in.
Of italic type was a way to save paper. I don't really know, but I can guess that paper cost was a substantial input cost of early printing presses. And so there would have been an incentive to try to save paper. And I can envision some early student of typography looking at slanted letters and thinking, well, they're closer together. Maybe, you know, it's a guess. Analytically, it's not borne out. But my guess is just someone knowing the input cost of a printing press saw that as a potential solution. The story's been repeated ever since then. So, Annabelle.
Scott, I did a little bit of typesetting, which you told me about, but one line was in Shakespeare's sign almost taking it. So how did Aldus have people to assist in the proofreading of these typesetting ventures?
It was a factory. It was a sweatshop, even. There's some eyewitness accounts of not just the Aldine press, but early presses. And you would have, in one corner of a room, people setting type, usually with a manuscript in front of them. And they would set type, and they got to the end of the line, they would draw a line on the manuscript. So some manuscripts still exist that we know were setting copy for books because there are marks on them. And then they would take that one line at a time and, build up the frame, probably run a trial sheet, a proof sheet that an editor, more often than not Aldus himself, would proofread. But time is of the essence here.
And so For 9 months, Erasmus was proofreading in Aldus's printing press, or all these Greek documents.
And so this is happening. The press itself was a rather large thing. There were almost certainly multiple presses. And so you've got one guy with the ink, putting the ink on it, another guy laying the paper. I mean, it was a factory. The paper gets hung up to dry because it's dampened before it's printed, things you all know. So it was a factory. And the output varied. In 1502, the Aldine Press printed 23 editions, one every 6 months, every month. Extraordinary level of output. There's a rather unflattering portrait of Aldus himself painted as sort of the stern taskmaster, burning the midnight oil and making sure that things were printed. So it's quite remarkable. But the good compositors could almost operate blind. And if you've ever watched, there aren't many people who do it anymore, but they know the layout of the type case so well that they've basically, you need 3 eyes. You need 1 eye for the type case, 1 eye for the manuscript, and 1 eye for the stick. We only have 2 eyes, so what do? You just learn the type case. So they start pulling type. They're not even looking at it. They know by feel that where the letters are. They're looking at the manuscript and setting type, which is all fine and good unless someone put the type back in the case the wrong way. And you get what are called foul case errors because the case itself is fouled up. And obviously there's some letters that are easier to foul up than others because you're operating in mirror, right? The P and the Q, for example, are very difficult to tell apart, and that's why you have to mind your P's and Q's. Other questions? Yeah, Kara. Aldus did not make his own paper. Is it known where the paper came from? Probably on the mainland of Italy. Paper making didn't require wood pulp in this era. It's all rag pulp, which is why the paper. I mean, this is a close-up of a book that was printed in 1499. The quality of the paper is extraordinary because there's really nothing to deteriorate. There's no wood pulp to it, but it did require a great amount of rags and rather large operations to make it. So probably made on the mainland in Italy, not terribly far from Venice. Fabriano, in particular, was a center of paper manufacture in the late 15th century. There's a lot of watermarks in these books. Yeah, I shouldn't say a lot, a fair amount of watermarks in these books. It's actually an aspect of the press that's lightly researched, Aldus's paper sources. I have just started going back through my own collection with a light sheet that you can see the watermarks much more clearly, and started to document some of that in an effort to try to figure out a little more precisely the answer to that question, where the paper sources came from. I have to charge you double for 2 questions. Contentious. What's that? Well, so, I mean, there's no question that Aldus hired Griffo. Griffo worked for Aldus. There's a great deal of question about who was the genius behind the type design. There's pretty good evidence Griffo thought it was him because he, around the year 1503, decided to print himself, that he was going to be a printer using his types. And Aldus said, you mean my types? And there was a legal case about it, and Griffo, in an effort to print anyway, left the Venetian Republic, sort of outside of the reach of Venetian law. He did print a few books in his own type, not many, and they're actually not very well printed. I mean, he may have been a good eye for type, but he was not a good printer. And then in about the year 1508, in a drunken rage, killed his son-in-law with an iron bar and was never heard from again. That's how the story ends. So he was either caught and held accountable for that murder or got out of town quick, but changed his name and to Erasmus. No, and so it was contentious, but all of the great typographical development, the Aldine Press, took place between about 1494 and about 1501. that you had the Greeks, the Bembo, the Roman type was already well established. The Bembo was a particular improvement on it, and then italics, and that was more or less it. There were minor things beyond that. So there's certainly Griffo had a lot to do with it. Yes, sir. Good question. And the answer is yes. Aldus did print on vellum. A frightfully expensive thing to do and hard to print on. Have you ever printed on vellum? Sure, you printed on vellum. No, hard to do. Paper takes the bite of the type. You dampen the paper, it takes a bite. Vellum does not take a bite. It's really hard to print on. Printers hate doing it. But so why would you do it? And the reason you would do it is there was demand for special copies of the books that he was printing. So in other words, there were book collectors in the 15th century. There were people who wanted not only a copy of Cicero, but they wanted a really nice copy of Cicero. And so they would commission Aldus, or Aldus would print the vellum copy. They would have it specially bound, more often than not illuminated. There were several, I think about 8 or 9 vellum copies in the exhibition, most of which were illuminated. So, I mean, these were works of art. And yes, other printers did likewise. But I think the Aldine Press, by virtue of the brand name, if you will, that Aldus had for printing really good texts and really clear and really fine type, there was demand for this. To the degree that the very first individual that we can identify as a collector of books in the 16th century collected Aldus. Aldus was a big part of his collection. His name was Jean Grolier, and the Grolier Club is named after him, sort of the patron saint of book collectors. If you walk into the Grolier Club, hanging to the left over the reception desk, there's a rather fanciful image of Jean Grolier in the house of Aldus. And there is nothing right with this picture. It's this beautiful scene with this open windows over the Venetian lagoon, plenty of space and great light, and printing shops were sweatshops. They'd look nothing like that. So it's a late 19th century fiction, but it's one we've come to love. But yeah, he printed a lot on vellum. Copies occasionally come on the market. There was one on the market earlier this year. They're very rare, as you might imagine, but a lot of vellum printing. Friends, thank you once again for your time and attention and interest in Aldus. And go to the Grolier Club, 60th Street between Park and Madison, open to the public 6 days a week. Hope to see you there. Thank you.
Okay, so that was that was looking at Aldus Manutius, and so obviously the first 40 minutes was, you know, a little bit more exciting than the last 20 minutes. But I'll just throw up here some of the things that we'll go through, because we'll continue on looking at Aldus. Now I've gone for 2.5 hours. I probably won't go for much more, but I'll just show you what we're going to go on to next time. We're going to continue to look at Aldus, because Aldus Manutius, and obviously they make different pages for the Aldine Press. Now this Griffo guy, I just looked him up, how he murdered his son-in-law with an iron bar, and that was the last he was ever heard of. So he was working for the Aldine Press. But so yeah, we'll look at the vast majority of this. We'll read through it. Now, of course, there's going to be things that interest us specifically around Erasmus, and what Erasmus had published, Greek Plato and a Polyglot Bible, which is very interesting. So I might even open up Polyglot there, because it seems to be a little bit related. And the Septuagint was printed by Aldus as well. That was the first ever Septuagint printed. Then we have the Septuagint printed by the Complutensian Polyglot. So that's interesting. Actually, I might type in Aldus here. Aldus, no. So yeah, we have the Complutensian Polyglot guys. Antwerp Polyglot is basically the Complutensian Polyglot text, but it was printed in 1572, so just after the Bishop's Bible sort of thing. Paris Polyglot, London Polyglot was mostly to do with Codex Alexandrinus, but it had a whole lot of other interesting things. So yeah, so we'll read through Aldus. We'll try and figure out what exactly the timeline of his Bible, because the first ever New Testament was printed by Aldus. He did 6 chapters of the Book of John, and so this is before Erasmus came and worked for him. So him and Erasmus living together for 9 months, and Erasmus working for him for 9 months. And him also printing Erasmus's books. This whole concept of printing the New Testament was something that was on both of their minds, and obviously it was a huge endeavor and something that Aldus he eventually did. But see, then there's the whole accusation: is the Aldus text just Erasmus's text, and all the rest of it? So we want to eventually nail those things down, and surely someone has done the homework on that, and we don't want to reinvent the wheel. But yeah, so Dutch philosopher Erasmus sought out Manutius to publish his translation of Iphigenia in Helios. So interesting, some interesting stuff there. So I'm just sort of actually, maybe I can just type in Bible, printed Bible. Printed New Testament. Okay, we've got Gutenberg Bible. Maybe it'll lead on to something else. Well, I guess we're looking at Greek Bible, aren't we? So maybe I can just go for search for Greek Bible. New Testament. Bible translations into Greek. Greek New Testament. Okay. I'll see if I can search for Aldus. No. Maybe Aldus here. Nope. Aldus. Nope. And okay, maybe Greek Bible. I'll type in Greek Bible, Aldus, 1506. Sometimes too, you find these old books. They're trying to sell these books, So this is an auction house. So they're selling this for between 15 and 20,000 Great Britain pounds. So that would be, I guess, the equivalent of like 40,000 American dollars. But sometimes you find some really interesting images. That are hard to find elsewhere. Basileon, Cephalo Alpha. Okay, so we're looking at, I guess, the Book of Kings. I'm pretty sure it is. The second book of Kings. Interesting. There doesn't seem to be much mention. Oh, yeah, here we go. Aldus Press. Okay, it was 1505, so that might be why it's not coming up. But we have a footnote here. Maybe 1505, Aldus. Okay, I think I've written on it. Aldine. Yeah, it would be great to find that and compare it. Maybe 1505. Okay, he met Aldus Manutius, an Italian printer who enriched this scholar with Byzantine manuscripts of the Greek New Testament and other writings. Okay, so this is my website, Aldine. Okay, digital collections. Go. Aldine. 1518. Okay, Katamattheon. This is the book of Matthew. Interesting. So anyway, it's going to take me a while to find all that information, but you know, we want to look at the printings of the Bible before Erasmus. So it looks like Distapolis published a revised version of the Vulgate, corrected against the Greek text, as well as a forward translation edition of the Psalms. So that's interesting. I've never really even heard of. I actually know I have heard of this guy. I'm pretty sure he was friends with Ruckman. Okay. He was visited by John Calvin. So yeah, anyway, so these are all people that we want to know about. We want to know about this era between the Gutenberg Bible and Erasmus, because this seems to be where critical text people have made up a lot of stories about Erasmus, and so we really want to get into the mind of Erasmus. We want to know, like here even talking about Manetti. So this is very important information, like someone who's defending the Textus Receptus. Manetti, he translated the New Testament from Greek and the Psalms from the Hebrew at the court of Pope Nicholas V around 1455. The manuscript still exists, but Manetti's version was not printed until 2014. Greek fragments have been printed as Greek fonts were cut. The Aldine Press published the first 6 chapters of John's Gospel in 1506. So, but Manetti, he was 70 years before Erasmus, and he did a New Testament based upon the Greek. You don't hear James White talking about that edition because it does have a lot of Textus Receptus type readings in it. So these are things that we want to examine, we want to look into. In my debate with James Snap Jr., I was in my evidences, so I'll just show you some of my evidences here. They're my axioms, but if we go to, say, Matthew 25 here. or maybe here. Here I've got Manetti because I wanted to go to Manetti and look up all of these issues, but that takes a lot of time. And so obviously with all of these, I've gone to ChatGPT as well, and sometimes ChatGPT makes some really bad errors, and so it can't be trusted. Where was it? I think it was in Acts. That's where I had the link to Manetti. Yeah, here we are. Manetti in the book of Acts. We'll just have a quick look at that. So this will just show you an example of the Manetti document, but you can, I'll let you guys have that link, because if you want to go to Manetti's document, you can just go there and check it out. And so here it's basically just a Latin document, but it is based upon Greek manuscripts. And so it echoes Greek manuscripts that they had before, 70 years before Erasmus. And so that's why when I've looked up the issue in Revelation chapter 1, verse 8, and I've put that information on my website, you can clearly see by checking Erasmus and then looking at Manetti. So Beatus of Libana, the Book of Marg. Here we have Manetti's manuscript, and he reads exactly the same as the King James. So he has what would be what is Latin, what would be in English. It has the word God is omitted there. It's nowhere in his text. It's nowhere in the King James, and that's basically like a parallel of it. And so I've got a nice, lovely picture of it. You can see here where it doesn't have the word God there. So people mistakenly say that, well, Erasmus, he didn't put God there. You know, he took it out of the text. Well, why did Manetti take it out of the text as well? So these are things that have to be taken into consideration. These are good evidences for these readings in the Textus Receptus, because these are Latin documents based upon Greek manuscripts, and it's clearly told that that's exactly what they're based upon. So, and we can clearly see too, like Beatus of Libana, the Book of Marg, they have the word God omitted. So the Beatus of Libana text is exactly identical to the King James Version, where most of the modern Bibles have saith the Lord God here. And even like James White and other people say, well, this is a place where the deity of Christ is shown because it's the Lord God, you know. But what it actually does, it makes it so people read it that it's the Father speaking, not Jesus. And so this causes confusion. And the Jehovah's Witnesses say this as well. Well, that's not Jesus speaking, it's the Father. But it's saying, I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the ending, which was and is to come, the Almighty. So Alpha and Omega is a title for God. Beginning and the ending is a title for God. It says the Lord, and then it has the etymology of the name of Jehovah, the past, the present, and the future. And then it calls him the Almighty. So by having God there, which is usually reserved for God the Father, usually when it's explaining it, it actually takes away from the verse because it makes it God the Father speaking. And so you can see Beatus of Libana has it exactly as the King James, Book of Marg. So when Jonathan Burris did his video on this, Revelation 1:8, he didn't know all this. And when Timothy Berg in the Textual Confidence Collective said that Erasmus mistakenly thought that theos there, he couldn't read the ligature and thought it meant something else. And so he accidentally like omitted that word. It's like, no. Are you saying the Book of Marg did that? Are you saying Beatus of Libana did the same thing? Manetti did the same thing? You know, it's just ridiculous. And so, so the claims of these, you know, modern day scholars are just, they fall to pieces when you know this information. But the thing is, a lot of people don't know this information about Manetti and others. And so we're going to look at all this. That's what the Byzantine school is all about. We want to become educated in this stuff. And so Avery F says it's very interesting. Erasmus came to Venice from his studies at Turin. Such an important place, Turin. Yes. We want to also look at Florence. We want to look at the Renaissance, all that happened there. And so anyway, guys, I think I'm going to finish this video up because I'm just sort of searching around a few different places and saying a few odd things here and there. But we will join you guys again sometime this week. Now, I'm organizing with Matthew Singleton to interview someone who is into higher criticism. So this is going to be a very interesting interview. So I'm just trying to work that out maybe for next weekend. But apart from that, I'll just do my usual videos probably on Tuesday night with the book, The King James Only Controversy. So we're going to be looking at that again. So last time we looked at James White and his claims about the Codex Sinaiticus. And so we're going to be looking at a few other things in that. And we're just going through some of the material that's a little bit boring in his book. It's just sort of bog standard, what the Bible is and what a manuscript is. But he does mention about Codex Sinaiticus and he has his own spin on it. So that's what my last video on that was. I'm going to read. I've read through it a few times now, but I want to read through it again and just make sure I'm not missing anything. And then he's looking at variants and text families and is explaining all that, which he doesn't follow anymore. And then we're going to be looking at a whole bunch of examples. And so anyway, guys, God bless you. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.